Good afternoon. Let's start our session 2 of the Spiderweb inaugural workshop. Session 2 named Governance Challenges, Institutional Building and National Response. We'll have two presenters, Emily Jones from Oxford University and Renato Boschke from ISP, INCT-PPED. And then we'll have three comments. Robert Wade, London School of Economics. Sebastian Plotienik, University from Varsovia. Okay, I'll try. Sorry. And then Heiner Keitel, University of Tallinn. Okay, 20 minutes for each presentation. That's good? Okay, Emily, you good? Okay.
Perfect. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. I work very closely with Nairi Woods, who's part of the network at the Global Economic Governance Programme at the University of Oxford. And regrets from her, because I know she would have loved to have been here with us. So today I'm going to address the question of state capacity really by looking at one empirical case study in depth. We've had a project at the programme for about 4 years now, looking at the way that small developing countries negotiate in the context of international global governance. Really addressing some of the questions that Anna Celia raised this morning when she said sort of how much room for maneuver do countries have, what are the degrees of constraints and also of freedom that are available. And the case study I want to share is between 76 African, Caribbean and Pacific countries, which are among the smallest and poorest or least developed in the world. So the majority of least developed countries, according to the UNCTAD definition, are in this group. And they negotiated over the last 10 years free trade agreements with the EU. So vast asymmetry, and the EU didn't get what it wanted. So I'm going to explore the reasons for this. And then the lessons from that for state capacity. So a quick overview of the EPA negotiations, and I've written it down because I know I tend to speak fast, so at least you can read, even if you haven't followed everything that I say. So we had 76 African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. They had a long-standing system of unilateral preferences since the colonial era. And then in the late 90s, the EU wanted to transfer the system of unilateral preferences into 6 regional free trade agreements, dubbed economic partnership agreements, when it was prompted by complaints at the WTO, which we can go into later if you like. But the point is, from these negotiations, that the EU sought really far-reaching obligations with very major implications for ACP policies. And so the emphasis for me will be on the politics of it, but I wanted you to understand the magnitude of what the EU was asking. So a few examples. So obviously the free trade in goods is the core of an FTA. The EU wanted the ACP countries to liberalize so substantially all trade, which the EU interpreted as 80% of tariffs reduced to 0 within 10 years. A little bit more flexibility in the time frame for least developed countries. They wanted a standstill on all tariffs from the point at which the agreement came into effect. So effectively, there was no more tariff policy. The elimination of all export taxes within 10 years and a freeze on current export taxes. Their services investment provisions were pretty stringent, including opening up majority of sectors, including mode 3 in non-services sectors, so agriculture, mining, so the rights of establishment of European firms, a regulatory freeze on all services standards, and a lot of new rules that the EU had proposed at the WTO and hadn't managed to see through, including on courier and financial services, requirements for unrestricted capital movement, albeit with a balance of payment safeguard. And the Caribbean did sign an EPA, and it was really seen as an avant-garde EPA, or a free trade agreement for the EU, because it went further than just about any other EU free trade agreement. And there are also a lot of rules therein on intellectual property, government procurement, including the access to government procurement markets. So in short, we've talked this morning about how trade has gone beyond trade in goods, and you have the evidence here. But what's very interesting for me is that the EU really didn't see its interests met and they're still trying to negotiate as we speak, despite starting in 2002. So the majority of ACP countries were critical of the EU's proposals, and negotiations were very fraught. Negotiations with the Caribbean states progressed smoothly, and an agreement was reached in 2007. but negotiations with the African and Pacific countries were very acrimonious. Now, the EU tried a variety of tactics to try and persuade and coerce or pressure countries into agreeing, but you can see from this example, the outcomes here, it really didn't succeed. So you have the Caribbean on the first column. 15 countries signed the so-called full EPA with all the issue areas addressed. 15 went on to then sign, and the 15 went on to implement. But the same is not true for Africa and the Pacific. So we see even a few of them were then initialing agreements that were partial in scope, so trade in goods and not the other sections. Of them, not all of them went on to sign. A lot of them delayed signature. And then even those who went on to sign didn't necessarily go on to implement. So how do we explain this outcome? So we've got a highly asymmetric negotiation, countries that have traditionally been incredibly dependent on the EU for trade, for aid. Turning to existing scholarship, there are really three ways that we analyze trade negotiations, I guess. And by far the most predominant is in the literature on political science, which draws very heavily from economics, where really everything is down to the domestic politics in a country. So governments are supposed to presume they would like to have free trade, but they get basically captured by domestic interest groups. So that's the dominant literature. Then you have a little bit of work which comes from Albert Hirschman in the 1940s mainly, which is basically saying that states have an underlying conflicting interest in trade, and that large states exert coercive pressure. So you have the sort of power dynamics coming into trade agreements. And then you have a third set of literature which arrives in the sort of late 90s, which is looking at negotiating strategies and tactics, particularly in the WTO and the ability of developing countries to use coalitions. So if we take these and we look at the EPA negotiations, what do we find? So I started by looking at the trade and aid dependence and the way that shaped the agreements. And the reason for starting at that point was having historically, it's the big structural shifts that have shaped the outcomes of past negotiations. And it's hard to underestimate or underemphasize the amount of pressure that came from the EU. The two big instruments the EU used was basically to threaten to withdraw, and it did withdraw unilateral trade preferences. And a lot of ACP countries, if you had the interviews with the negotiators, they really feared that their aid would be cut, and two of the quotes there. And the interesting thing there in terms of power in the international system is that countries or negotiators feared that aid would be cut even if the EU didn't make explicit references or threats. So the question then is, why did so few sign? And part of that is a very rapid reduction that we've seen in the last 15 years of trade dependence on the EU and the rise of Brazil, India, and China. And part of that is a sort of, especially with the African countries, a sense that there are new opportunities, there are new trading partners. So the psychology of dependence is nowhere near as strong. But also it means that the EU's threat didn't have the same kind of impact as it would have had, say, 10 years ago. And we've also seen a rapid decline in aid dependence on the EU as well, and a reduction in debt, partly with the rapid growth of these countries. So the structural story was not quite as bad as it had been in terms of dependence back in the 90s. A very simple regression that we ran showed that where countries were dependent on trade preferences, there was a very strong and statistically significant correlation between the costs of losing trade preferences, i.e. the EU's threat, and then the decision to sign an EPA. So countries where there were sectors, export sectors, dependent on these preferences, the EU said we're taking them away, they pretty much, most of them signed. But the interesting point here is that many countries didn't, partly because of the composition of exports, and partly because they had other options for accessing the EU market. So that trade, where it was effective, the threat of losing trade preferences sort of had a big impact. We didn't find any strong relationship between aid dependence and the decision to sign, which was an interesting one for me. But we also see some countries that are heavily dependent on EU preferences, namely Namibia, Kenya, and Ghana, that didn't sign, even though the exporters were very worried about losing preferences. The second sort of cut or analytical lens to look at the EPA negotiations. So the first sort of structural factors determine whether countries signed or not. But then what we see in 2007 is we had very different texts on the negotiating table. So how did they get the variation? And here what we see is that ACP countries, by maneuvering at the negotiating table, were able to shape what was actually in the contents of the agreements. And we saw broadly 3 different negotiating strategies. We saw the Caribbean cooperate and seek to make very minor changes, albeit some significant ones, in the technical details. They therefore signed the full EPA and they got these minor concessions. But what we also saw was African and Pacific countries decide to resist. And they did so in 2 ways. So the ones that had more technical capacity put counter-proposals on the table, so the Pacific, Southern Africa, and Eastern Africa. And they often didn't manage to get their counter-proposals accepted, but they did manage to get a lot of issues off the negotiating table. And they also got quite a lot of concession in the detail. Then we have the third group of countries, which for me are some of the most interesting. Because it's West Africa and Central Africa, which really have the least technical capacity, a lot of poverty, so sort of institutional constraints are very severe. But they managed to hold out and they managed to block a lot of issues on the table. So although they didn't get the concessions in the fine detail, they did get, they signed far less of fewer issue areas than the EU had wanted. And then we had the third period where countries had signed partial agreements. And again, this speaks to me of the sort of national strategies, because even those who'd signed didn't necessarily go on to implement. So we had, again, the Caribbeans who cooperated for the main. But we had this group of countries that continued to resist, even though they'd sort of initialed an agreement. So Namibia and Guyana was a very much open confrontation with the EU, and Namibia still hasn't signed the agreement. Others adopted delay tactics. So it wasn't very confrontational, but Ghana, for example, just kept postponing. We have to do another impact study, we can't yet get around to signing, various reasons for delaying. And then we have another group of countries that are really in the majority of African countries who had signed that just didn't go and implement. So it's kind of mock compliance. They didn't ever complain, they just didn't implement it. And then we had a group of countries that exited. But again, this type of the space and the scope for sort of non-implementation, I think, is quite an interesting one. Then the third and final cut is then the domestic politics, because we still have this question of why did the Caribbean enter and agree to this agreement, and why did the African and Pacific countries decide to resist? And the literature, the dominant literature, says basically we should look to domestic politics and the pattern of lobbying. So if you look at a lot of the scholarship, the sort of so-called mainstream scholarship, it says probably Africa and the Pacific were sort of hijacked by protectionist interests. So that's why they wouldn't want free trade. But when we actually map out the lobbying, and we did so in 17 countries, we find that lobbying is at best a partial explanation. As many of you know, post-structural adjustment, there isn't a very strong, big industrial sector in a lot of African countries. So there really wasn't the push against it from the manufacturing sector, apart from perhaps Nigeria. There was a big push against it from civil society, and to some extent the farmers. But it's really hard to attribute Africa and Pacific's resistance to purely these effects or these lobbying. And we also have, in a lot of the preference-dependent countries, very strong lobbying for the EPA from exporters and donors. What are the factors then? And finally, as well, an interesting thing is that we also see some mobilization by governments of the society. So in Namibia or Senegal, government had decided it didn't want the EPA, and it then set about mobilizing the interest groups to join it, to then push against. So again, the lobbying sort of went the wrong way, or the way that we wouldn't expect. So again, it speaks to a lot of government agency, even in these sort of small and least developed countries. So what factors do seem to have pushed for or led these countries to resist? Part of it was the impact studies and the information analysis. It was very clear they'd lose a lot of money in terms of fiscal revenues, which for a lot of countries was a big issue. But also, I think a lot of the sort of policy dialogue and ideas, really, the policy debate that's emerged in the last 10 years, their own experience of structural adjustment, the fact that most international organizations and eminent figures were very wary of the EPAs and advised against it, particularly the South Center, I know, did a huge amount of work with African governments, UNCTAD, but also the World Bank. I mean, the World Bank and IMF were also disagreed and criticized the agreements. So I think that really weighed into the decisions of African governments. And then partly geopolitics in Africa. and in the Pacific. So in Africa, there was concern that then signing the agreement would undermine regional integration. It would undermine emerging geopolitical relations with China, India, other emerging economies. And for the Pacific in particular, was very worried about setting a negative precedent for free trade agreement negotiations with New Zealand and Australia. But for me, what was interesting is that we assume a lot of these countries don't have the capacity in government to make a lot of policy decisions, but I think here we have a lot of evidence that they certainly were. Moving on to the Caribbean and why the Caribbean cooperated, again, lobbying is only a partial explanation. There was quite a lot of lobbying for the trade agreements from the rum, banana, sugar, the sort of traditional preference-dependent sectors. A little bit from tourism and financial services. But I remember interviewing the head of the Services Association in Barbados, and they said, and services had been the big reason that the government had said they'd signed up to this. And they said, we're really not sure why the government has pushed for all these concessions and made them all because we can't use them. So again, it really wasn't necessarily a lobbying story. And there was a little bit of protest against the EPA from civil society. So then why did the Caribbean sign up? Geopolitics, I think, is the big one here. So they have DR CAFTA on the back door. And there was a sense so I interviewed a lot of the ministers in the Caribbean, and there was a sense that they will have to negotiate with the US. And they wanted to set a favorable precedent with negotiations with the EU, because they thought the EU would be a sort of more generous negotiating partner, which didn't turn out to be the case. I think they got quite a shock, actually, quite a few of the negotiators. But also then the policy implications. And what's really interesting in the Caribbean is that there's a very strong development vision amongst sort of certain groups, particularly in Barbados and Jamaica, and the Caribbean negotiating machinery, that sort of unfettered globalization is the way forward for the Caribbean. And there's one quote here from 2000 from the US, the Jamaican ambassador, that the ACP need to participate in and facilitate the rapid and frictionless international mobility of goods, services, finance. And interestingly, he was then appointed the lead negotiator. So for the Caribbean, I think it was this mix of geopolitics and then the sort of development vision. So where does this bring us then with the question of state capacity? First, I think the EPA negotiations, for me, certainly challenged the assumption that the smallest, least developed countries have got minimal agency on the international stage. Clearly, there are major constraints. I don't think we should underestimate them at all, particularly in the sort of pressure that comes externally. But there is some room for maneuver. Partly, we're seeing a diversification of external partners, again, with the rise of trade and aid with China, so that these countries are less vulnerable to the kind of classic coercion that Hirschman identifies. And to some extent, countries themselves determine that, at least in the medium to long run, right? So the extent to which your country is dependent on preferences or dependent on aid from a single source is something that's within, to some extent, countries' policy decision-making. In terms of the tactics, we saw the technical expertise, for example, in the Caribbean was needed to get negotiations in the fine detail of texts. But really the blocking power and resistance, which turned out to be quite strong and powerful in the case of African countries, were political moves. So if you see in the Central African region, at some point the technical negotiators had actually been convinced by a lot of the EU negotiators to sign up or to agree, make a lot of preliminary agreements, and it was the ministers that pulled them back and said, we're not prepared to do that. So the ministers and the political moves of the political elite turned out to be the most important in that region. And then at the domestic level, the other lesson I think that comes out of this work is that even these countries have a lot of, or some leeway at least, to set policy. So interest group matters, and we do have some instances of sort of capture of governments by interest groups. But really, information and ideas still shape policy. So to sum up, I think it is the sort of the room for maneuver and state capacity, and really understanding exactly what the constraints are and looking for the sort of niches and the little areas where countries can maneuver. That turns out to be quite important for state capacity. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'll move from, you know, the discussion from an essentially empirical one that we just had to a more theoretical and methodological discussion, aiming at suggesting some points of in the consideration of a development agenda, having in view the problems and contents that we want to define for our Spiderweb experience. And so it's interesting that I was commenting with some of my political scientist friends here during lunchtime that in the morning, a number of issues that were discussed and pointed out actually considered the political dimension as a very important element in terms of what was being discussed, namely the question of how endogenous domestic processes can actually make a way to development or change the agency capacity of some countries in the international context, in arenas of negotiation, etc. But all of that, it occurred to me, was very, even though the political dimension was being brought into scene, was very implicit. In the whole discussion, the political dimension was implicit. And it's not until we gather a number of political scientists, perhaps the next time we'll have to mix in terms of organizing the sessions, mix political scientists and economists, or having a different sort of arrangement. Because sometimes I have a feeling that we are speaking to our own constituency only. And only the constituency is able to understand what I am talking about, the same way that when the economists talk about the importance of politics and things like that, it's as if they have a common understanding of what it means, but it actually, requires specification, right? So this session is particularly devoted to calling attention to the political dimensions in defining a development agenda, right? And so what I'm trying to address is the question of national responses, suggesting some points in the research agenda which seem to me to be very important, but going beyond the recognition that institutions matter and politics are important, or that the state has to be taken into account. I mean, we've heard a lot of that, and we've heard a lot of that coming from economists and political scientists alike, and in a consideration of a literature that deals specifically with national responses to issues of economic development, which is the literature that we've been working with, the varieties of capitalism approach. So it is important to make clear some of these political dimensions and how they can actually be taken into account in a systematic way, rather than just saying that the state matters, institutions, political institutions matter, etc. We rely in our research project, which is just starting, and it's underway, but we've already progressed a little bit in terms of discussing some of these political dimensions. We rely very much on the notion of state capacity, which is just what has been presented here. But we have to have some understanding of what or how the issue of state capacity matters in terms of some of the other processes that we are talking about here. In terms of the domestic processes that have to be understood in terms of as it was labeled or mentioned here this morning, make the way towards development. no, and it relying on domestic processes, which calls attention to the role of coalitions of support, definition by strategic elites of what the projects are, not in the short run only, but in the mid and in the long run. It involves the operation of political institutions at given point in time, and not only institutions related to state bureaucracy, as we might think, at a first glance, when we talk about state capacity, but also political institutions in a broader perspective, calling attention to regime characteristics and the whole issue of how democratic institutions, for example, and the whole question of electoral competition makes a difference in terms of defining arenas, in terms of finding support, in terms of finding routes from a certain moment on in terms of the development agenda. So this is basically what I'm going to be addressing here today. On a very broad level of considerations, actually, having as a background issues and aspects of the Brazilian trajectory, and how some of the lessons that can be extracted from the Brazilian trajectory would help frame, other examples from a comparative point of view, which is in fact from a methodological standpoint, it's what we are considering here, what we've been discussing in the morning, and what we are discussing now. Comparisons, how we establish comparisons, what are the factors that are responsible or that can be identified as responsible for different degrees of economic performance, which is what development is all about. Okay, so if I identify some of the factors as being important in terms of the performance of a specific case, I have to show that the lack of such factors are important in terms of explaining why other experiences are not, were not, or are not as successful as that particular one. But one first aspect, I'm sorry to bother with some methodological questions, but they have substantive implications. One first aspect that I think the whole discussion about establishing ideal types and seeing how empirical cases move in the space defined by ideal types, which is basically what the literature of varieties of capitalism proposes. That it's important to consider given experiences as not finished cases. There is no such thing as a finished case, because processes of change are underway, and analysis have to be able to grasp how change operates and in which ways institutions move when we talk about these changes. So, thinking about this, it is important to take into account the fact that development is a long run process that can only be understood in a broader time frame. And considering that experiences are always changing in given directions, and they are not finished realities that once they attain some specific characteristics, they are frozen or they stop in that particular with a particular set of characteristics. And so that's what comparisons should address. And in fact, the discussion in the varieties of capitalism literature addresses the issue of institutional change as an important aspect in analyzing economic performance of different cases as they define by ideal types as coordinated market economies or liberal market economies or state-led market economies, which is another category, all of which I think are too broad in terms of being able to grasp, the whole variety of specific cases. And here I introduce the importance of focusing on trajectory elements, which are important in terms of clearing up the field of comparisons. When we talk about trajectory, we are calling attention to specific elements in the process of development of given experiences, which do not deny the possibility of comparison. Rather, it elucidates how certain aspects over time can make a difference or can open up possibilities in terms of changing a given course, or, as the literature puts it, of defining some critical junctures in the process of critical junctures are very important, but the thing about critical junctures is that the actors are not able to perceive that they are undergoing or they are going through one of these critical junctures at a given point in time. It's only in retrospective that we can actually evaluate that such junctures were critical. Okay, so it's important then to see in the long run how these critical junctures can actually open up possibilities and change a given course, a given previous course of events, which in turn this course of events has to do, is firmly based on prevailing views of elites regarding frames of references that elites have about what is the country or what is the future or what is important in terms of defining processes of development or growth, leading sometimes to the perception that you can have predatory processes from elite views, or you can have processes that are positive, let's put it that way, regarding the views of elites in a different direction. In fact, there is a whole preoccupation in the literature in terms of understanding why some elites, strategic elites in given contexts, are predatory, while others invest in development strategies. So institutional change actually has to do with contested frames of reference in elite perceptions, which are important in terms of changing the course of events in a given direction, or maintaining or conserving, as we saw in the morning, a conservative view or a conservative outlook in terms of saying that what the status quo is good enough and we're not going to be able to change anything. So contested frames of reference are important in that respect. And so if we're talking about then trajectories, let me just exemplify with the Brazilian case, because it seems to me it's do I have time? Yeah. It seems to me that from the Brazilian case, as well as from other cases for that matter, but dwelling on the Brazilian case, we can come to some substantive views regarding processes of development, the content of processes of development, the role of political institutions, and contested frames of reference in what concerns traditional elites' views on development. And that's what we are talking about here when we are discussing the Spiderweb and a school of higher studies in advanced studies or whatever in development. We are trying to build different ideas that can either contribute or contest existing frames of reference, and showing new ways to think of the national responses of in our case of in the case of Brazil in a different way. So the literature of varieties of capitalism calls attention to some aspects which reduce uncertainty and contribute towards establishing coordination among strategic actors at the level of firms. So there are a number of characteristics that are listed in that approach, regarding how complementarities may actually be established in terms of finding, these strategic arrangements or some sort of equilibria vis-a-vis the behavior of firms. On the other hand, when talking about the application of these concepts to the cases of Latin America or the case of some other peripheral countries, a lot of discussion has addressed the issue of the state, because in some countries like the semi-peripheral, to use a concept, or developing in the context of developing countries, the notion that complementarities can be established at the level of firms only does not hold, given the important role of the state in compensating actually for lack of complementarities that do not occur at the level of strategic behavior of firms, right? So as in that case, we can mention that the propensity of entrepreneurs to invest in social policies, the issue of industrial relations and forms of protection of labor, training of and processes of training and education of the labor force, issues related with innovation and so on and so forth. So it's a well-agreed notion. The fact that the state compensates for absence of complementarities that do not occur at the level of firms only. And I myself have had a very long debate with one author, which is Ben Schneider, that deals and tries to apply the notion of a specific variety of capitalism in Latin America, which he describes as being hierarchical, which, I think, it describes pretty much of what an ideal type would be, but it does not establish fundamental differences in the performance, in the economic performance of given countries within that broad matrix. Because he talks about the presence of large economic groups as being one characteristic of capitalism in Latin America. Okay, this is true of most countries. He talks about the presence of multinationals as another aspect of the reality of Latin American countries, which change altogether the whole notion about the capacity to invest, or the desire to invest in innovation, the desire to train labor, etc., leading to what he, again, correctly describes as low productivity traps, okay, that tend to characterize the situation of or this hierarchical variety of capitalism in Latin America. But if we take specific cases into account, and I'll come back to the issue of trajectory, we see that there are some distinctions in the way some of these dimensions are dealt with, either because of the role of the state, either because of the either because of the influence of political institutions, or because some random effects in terms of the trajectory took place at a given point in time, altering the possibilities for economic performance of a given national context. What do I have in mind when I talk about this? I have in mind, for example, the fact that if you consider the dimensions pointed out in VOC literature, the whole issue of industrial relations, for example, is 2 minutes. The whole issue of industrial relations is one aspect that stands out in the Brazilian experience and lacks in other experiences, or else have been flexibilized or changed very quickly, as was the case in Chile, as was the case in Mexico, or latecomers to the process of labor protection. Venezuela, for example. No, the Brazilian case is different in precisely that dimension. Forms of protection of labor, right? And it makes a difference in terms of the performance, of the economic performance that we are now experiencing, given some trajectory elements specific of the Brazilian case. Which elements and which institutions matter and when? I'm talking about a corporatist legislation protecting labor and framing the relations between the private and the public sector in Brazil. On one hand, controlling labor, but on the other hand, also promoting strong forms of protection of labor. It is well known that in this first juncture, the political literature has called attention to the fact that the first critical juncture, important in defining routes of development for Latin American countries, had to do with the ways in which the working class was incorporated into the political process. In the case of Brazil, it was through a cooperative legislation that prevented the emergence of the working class in the political arena in a let's say, in a conflictual and in a disorganized way. But at the same time, guaranteeing, from the point of view of the frames of references of elites, strong protection of labor. The whole question about minimum wages in Brazil, we've talked about some of that in the morning. I saw Luiz Oreiro and others mentioning that dimension. And I made a comment with Lavinia. I don't understand why economists think that protecting minimum wage or valuing the wages is detrimental to development. I think it's the other way around. Maybe I don't understand economic equations that well, but in my understanding, it's an important aspect. And it continues to be an important aspect, which opened up in recent times a possibility for an inward oriented development in the case of Brazil, with politics of policies of social inclusion, of expanding the consumer's market and things like that. We forget about this. But the importance of minimum wages in the dynamics of Brazilian capitalism is not to be underestimated. And it is part of the heritage of the trajectory that started with this first critical juncture in the way in which working class was incorporated into the political process, the way in which, through a cooperative structure of interest representation, forum, nuclei of discussion, interlocution between the private sector and the state were established over time. And in a second moment, which I will define as the second critical juncture, occurring at the time of the political democratization and reforms, economic reforms, market-oriented reforms. In the case of Brazil, the working class came to power by means, not the working class, it's strong to put it in that way, a labor-based party of wage earners, let's put it that way, because I don't want to be misunderstood, and I was misunderstood in several contexts as if I was, as taking a point of view of exaggerating in terms of what I was trying to address, especially now in Paris, which people came to me, but a working class, what are you talking about? It's they're no longer trade union leaders in politics. So let's put it that way: a worker based salary, waged earners based party that came to power through the institutions of electoral democracy. And that makes a difference, because just like in the former historical experience of social democracy, workers were framed in terms of the parliamentary competition. In the same way, wage earners, in the case of Brazil, were able, through a labor-based party, to achieve central the positions of central power, address a number of issues as priority, overvaluing the minimum wage as an important aspect of the development process, and in so doing, opening up a new perspective for development. These are the domestic processes that many people were referring to this morning as being the important domestic, the ways to make ways into development that will eventually change important positions, power positions at the international level. So, to bring the discussion only, so these are trajectory effects then that have to be taken into account, and that were not, did not happen in the same way, just for a matter of the way the time frame operated. There is a question of the late process of market reforms that took place in Brazil, and this double transition of economic and political. Economic transition and political transition on one side being lumped together in the case of Brazil, whereas in other cases, economic reforms came first, etc. So there is a whole discussion about sequence of events, etc., that make a difference. But what I mean to point out when I talk about trajectory effects and changes or institutional changes over time is precisely this, that first, one political institution that made a difference in the first critical juncture and still remains as an important institution has to do with the corporatist structure that was set up in the 1930s and the labor legislation that was established then, which changed altogether the whole issue of industrial relations in the case of Brazil. And in the second moment, the fact that this labor-based party came to power by means of electoral competitions and stressing electoral competition as the main aspect of its second inclusion into politics. So, of course, external variables, this occurred in the closed space of national where the state, the national boundaries, where the state has an important role in terms of capacities and exerting capacities, etc. But of course, Brazil, as any other country for that matter, is not an island. And it operates within an international context, which happens to be the ones that we've been talking about this morning and right now. Okay, so you have to compete for power positions, change these power positions in a strategic way, etc. But in order to achieve some degree of success at the external level, here I come to the concept of state capacity. It is important that, that a number of capacities that have to do basically with managing the distributive conflict internally, managing to form coalitions of support, managing to operate within the context of democratic institutions, which makes a tremendous difference because it requires transparency, it requires alternance, it requires supports of all sorts, etc. So the political dimension is very important in everything that we are talking about here, or that we will talk eventually in the next few days regarding economic performance and possibilities of changing in a very favorable way. Let's stress this at this moment because of the crisis and whatnot, changing important power positions at international fora, and therefore being able to construct new avenues for economic development or performance. I will stop here. In fact, I had a lot of other things. I start talking and I get lost, but I see that my colleague Fabiano and many others are looking at me with a weird face. Stop.
You'll have time.
Stop. It's time to stop, and we'll discuss more moments to come.
You'll have time to develop those issues. So let's go to the comments. Please, Robert Wade.
I want to begin with Emily's paper. Emily's paper is a piece of optimism. That is, it says the essential argument is that even small and poor states can find room for maneuver if governments maneuver in the international context around international rules, if their governments wish to use that room. The room is there to be found and exploited. And just sort of in parenthesis, let me give an example of this, though it's not from trade, it's from capital controls. I was talking to the governor of the Central Bank of Taiwan in 1999 after the Asian crisis, and he explained he was very upset that the way that Taiwan's negotiators at the WTO, who were negotiating Taiwan's membership of the WTO, were giving up all Taiwan's capital controls as a condition of entry. And he said that he profoundly disagreed, but he couldn't stop them from giving away the official controls. And so what he was doing at that very moment was to recruit PhDs in financial engineering to constitute a secret cadre in the depths of the central bank, who would be able to put into place very covert and discretionary control mechanisms, so that he would be able to continue to exercise controls over capital, even as Taiwan declared that it was free of capital controls. In terms of trade, there's an excellent book by Richard Ludey-Neurath. It's cited in the bibliography to my book, Governing the Market, if you want to get the exact reference. But it's about Korea's trade regime. And his basic point is to show how through the 1980s, as Korea was declaring major trade liberalizations in line with US pressure to liberalize, it was putting in place a whole set of covert trade controls so that it was able to go on managing trade in line with an industrial policy. The first conclusion then of Emily's paper is that there is this room for maneuver, and the more general point is, as she said, ideas and information shape policy. So this is a nod, this is support for a constructivist view of international relations. A second main conclusion was that the EU did not get what it wanted from these poor and small states. And when I saw the list of what the EU was demanding, I thought, well, it's hardly surprising that the EU did not get anything like what it wanted, but still there is a question. Did the EU nevertheless get a lot of what it was wanting from this very long wish list? I wanted to say something thirdly about state capacity. One of my questions is who was negotiating on the part of these small and poor states? To what extent were external bodies, for example, was the World Bank helping them to negotiate against the EU? You said that the World Bank and the IMF were actually quite critical of what the EU was wanting. What about the South Centre? Was the South Centre supplying negotiators to help them push back? What about the African Union? So that's an important question. And related to that, there's a question of how were they able to coordinate? To what extent were they coordinating in pushing back? Or to what extent was the EU able to split them up and play upon differences between them? So those are a number of questions that I think would be worth following up. And just finally on the point about state capacity, let me mention the case of Singapore. Singapore and the US Free Trade Agreement signed in about 2003 or 4. I went to Singapore. I talked to the trade minister in late 2003, I think it was, and he said that they had been negotiating with the US for this free trade agreement for a long time. They'd come to an absolute sticking point. The sticking point was capital controls. The government of Singapore said there may be circumstances in which we have to put on exchange controls, and the US said no. This is the make or break issue. Around about April of 2004, I was very surprised to read that Singapore had signed this free trade agreement. And so I went back to Singapore in about May, a month later, and I talked to the same trade minister. I said, why did you sign the free trade agreement? Why did you agree to the provision was that any US investor who lost money as a result of the Singapore government imposing foreign exchange controls had to be compensated in line with the formula. So I said, why did you agree? And he said, well, look, in the end, it came down to security, not to economics. We want the US to be very deeply involved in this part of the world for security reasons. We want its navy to be going up and down. And we thought in the end that it would help our security objectives if we signed on to the free trade agreement. And my guess is that the Singapore government is doing just what the Korean government and the Taiwanese government earlier did, which is finding ways covertly to get around this overt agreement that they will not impose foreign exchange controls or will compensate American investors. On Renato's very interesting talk, I just have one main series of points to do with state capacity. One question is how we define state capacity. And for example, we can talk about legal capacity, we can talk about fiscal capacity. A second point, and it gets to Emily's paper again, is how rulers use a degree of whatever degree of state capacity that they have. In particular, for example, to what extent do rulers use state capacity to redistribute resources to themselves and take resources away from groups that wish to be rulers, or to what extent do state rulers provide public goods, use state capacity to provide public goods? And I'll mention two interesting books in this connection. One of them is by John Brewer, called The Sinews of Power. And this book is an historical account of how a very small island off the coast of Western Europe became the global hegemonic power for about 150 years. A very puzzling event. And Brewer relates this, partly at least, to the structure, the capacity of the British state, above all, the British state being able in the 17th century to put in place an extraordinarily efficient tax-raising bureaucracy using excise taxes, of which later, by the way, Adam Smith was a commissioner after he wrote the first edition of The Wealth of Nations. Also, Thomas Paine, was a functionary of the British Excise Department. This was a super efficient tax-raising bureaucracy, and Brewer in this book, The Sinews of Power, spells out exactly what were the institutional features that allowed the British state to raise much more revenue than, say, the French state or the Prussian state, with which it then financed a navy, and the navy then was the platform on which the British Empire was rolled out. And the second book is the recent book by Torsten Persson and Tim Besley called The Pillars of Prosperity. And this book is
By whom?
By Torsten Persson and Timothy Besley. Besley is at LSE. Persson is at the International Institute of Economic Studies in Stockholm. And not incidentally, he's not only a member of the Nobel Prize Committee in Economics, but he is the secretary of the Nobel Prize Committee in Economics. So what he says carries great significance, and how he says what kind of methodology he uses carries great significance for the Nobel Prizes. Anyway, this book is all about an analysis of the incentive structures in which states operate, in which state rulers operate, whether to use their position to redistribute resources to themselves, to entrench themselves in power, or use their resources to provide public goods. So, and they not only provide a highly mathematical model, but they also do lots of econometric tests. And the final point I make comes back to the agenda of Spider, and to something that Renato talked about, contested views about development. Well, one field of highly contested views about development, and indeed the whole human project, is climate change. And I wanted to draw your attention to a very recent book by Mike Hume called Why We Disagree About Climate Change. And this is a very interesting lens in which to get into a whole range of development issues. I was surprised and actually disappointed to be told, disappointed if what I was told is true, that Brazil in international forums has actually been quite hostile to a lot of the push for to get states to deal seriously with climate change. Brazil, I am told, takes the line that this is very much within a matter of national sovereignty, and Brazil is not going to be particularly active in leading coalitions of developing countries to push in this direction. However, we do have Rogério Studart here, the executive director for Brazil at the World Bank, and I would be curious to know whether what I've been told about Brazil's position on climate change is at all accurate. But in any case, my point is that this is a subject that doesn't seem to appear in these papers about the Spider agenda, but I do think it would be a very powerful context in which to discuss much bigger development issues.
Thank you. Sebastian. Sebastian Ploschenik.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. And I would like to start with comments on Emily's paper. And I understood it as a kind of scheme to analyze more cases of such international negotiations, asymmetric international negotiations. It could be useful. The question is only if all the points cover the major problems. And I couldn't resist, of course, and I started to analyze, to impose your framework on the history of negotiations between Eastern European countries and the European Union, because it might sound a little bit provoking, but 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, Eastern Europe could be considered as a kind of global South. So Eastern Europe in the global South, yeah, because of post-colonial complexes and underdevelopment. And here we can put, the association agreement from 1993, then the process of negotiation about a membership in the European Union, and even now the long way to the Eurozone of many of these countries. So, we can test some hypotheses and see if there might be something new. Yeah? So first of all, this coercive power. So you said that coercion is an integral part of such negotiations, and you could make it less painful if you have possibility to diversify your connections, international connections. So. At that time, Eastern Europe, particularly in the 90s, had no exit options, actually. The only way out from the trap of the old bad times was integration with Western countries. And we can see now some possibilities connected with such an open stage on the example of Ukraine. Ukraine is negotiating now an agreement, free trade agreement with the EU, and is using without any restrictions two options: EU or Russia. And this negotiation pattern changes every 6 months. Another case is also China, which the prime minister of the country visited last year Eastern Europe with 300 business people. Well, a little bit too late, I would say, and also to negotiate effectively. Well, what could have limit this coercion, in my opinion, and this is maybe something that might be stressed a little bit more in such research, is that in such asymmetric negotiations, international civil society is very important. Yeah? You can simply invite representatives of global think tanks, international think tanks, and exert some pressure over them. And also membership in international organizations is very important. I think this is why countries like Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Hungary wanted to join as many and as quickly as possible international organizations, simply to have a more visible stage for the arguments. Next point, strategies and tactics. It's in such negotiations. You said that expertise plus political will could bring a kind of game change in negotiations. Yeah? So for these negotiations, it was very characteristic that very quickly a kind of integrated group of Central and Eastern European countries quickly collapsed. We don't know whether it were conflicts within the group or a strategy of EU negotiation strategy of the European Union. But I think the second option might bring some arguments, because we've heard from Brussels about two options: whether a race, yeah, so who would be the first one in the EU, and Czech Republic was here the leader actually, and the president of the country actually accepted this vision that Czech is absolutely on the top and will be the first member of the EU. And the second option, a convoy. So all the countries should move in a convoy to the EU. And when the EU realized that the second option is actually cheaper and safer, they supported this way of negotiations. And about methods of small countries. Conditionally, I could agree with your argument that small countries, under some circumstances, have quite interesting power, and I think they can use it if they have very specific expertise on some fields, and this was visible during the negotiation. So, the partners on the EU side were sometimes simply less, not so good prepared for negotiation about a very specific topic brought on the table by some countries. And also political asymmetry. I think, and you mentioned as well this question, EU is not a typical state. So you cannot negotiate with them like with the United States. It's a bunch of countries, and every country from the Eastern European countries could a little bit diversify interests, visit some capitals of the EU members, and destroy or a little bit hamper the strategy of of the EU group from Brussels. And I think also the way how EU negotiates within the organization, so that nobody should leave the table without a success. You need it at home, so it's not possible simply to go to home as a leader of the country and to say, we are a loser, we are losers. Yeah, so sorry. No, everybody should be a winner. And from the past, you know, Aznar, as an ugly European, you know, such cases are actually quite very brutal negotiation strategy within the EU, which was pretty successful. I think Eastern European countries were pretty much impressed by this efficiency. Yeah? The third group of arguments, domestic political economy, and first of all, lobbying. I think that in all these countries, political and economic lobbying was very strong, and protectionist arguments were hard to find in an open debate. Lobbying groups were actually using civil society to smuggle these arguments. And just one example, Polish farmers, 2002, 80% against the membership in the EU, 20% supporting this. I don't know, maybe they simply did not believe that something that absurd like the common agricultural policy could exist. Yeah? But when they realized 2006, 80% of them supported the common agricultural policy just within 4 years. Yeah? So this was really surprising, but well, the price was pretty high, because I think this policy is freezing part of labor force of Poland and other countries on land, and this is not a very efficient solution. Geopolitics. Here's the difference, and I think it's more. There is more connection with your arguments about Singapore and the United States. For CEC countries, this way to the West was absolutely the most important thing. This debate about geopolitics, to escape from Russia's umbrella to the West, was killing any kind of economic debate at the end of the day, we can say. Yeah? So this was very important. Well, maybe also one word about the technical expertise, preparing some convincing documents about advantages of joining the European Union. Of course, there have been many of them. The production of this expertise was a booming branch of the bureaucracy. However, now, particularly on the way to the EU, these documents do not play anymore such a significant role. Maybe because the experience of the past is also very important. Just one example from the United Kingdom. United Kingdom opened the labor market for Eastern European as the first country. And 2003 or 2002, I think, a report of the British Ministry of Interior. How many Eastern Europeans will come to UK to look for jobs? 60,000. How many came? 2 million. Because simply what was underestimated, that migrants create networks, and these networks simply lower price for new migrants. You know, so this was ignored. And today the debate about the Eurozone membership resembles actually the past. So we are not able to assess all the costs of this process. And the last argument, development model, and here I will refer to Renato's arguments from his paper. Well, you mentioned that this negotiations about free trade agreement were connected also with a vision how to modernize a country. And it was 20 years ago a kind of simplistic vision. Let's open up markets, let's make the economy liberal. 1989, Poland had the most open economy behind Singapore because of new law, the last law of the communist government, you know. Proceeding with the integration process, now we realize that it's not like we will work hard and at the end, maybe 2-3 decades, we will achieve the the average level of the EU. Somewhere in between, there is a high cliff of the middle income trap. Yeah? And you are not able to jump over this cliff without industrial policy. So if you simply open up everything and you give up clever industrial policy, then you might have a problem. And another problem is that being on the brink of this trap, of this cliff, you can have a quite comfortable situation. And Poland is a good example for this trajectory. Because firstly, we opened our economy and many international companies simply came to Poland and wiped out Polish competition in the sense that, okay, there were labors, there were factories producing for the international market, but still they were settled in the low-cost segment. In addition to that, 80% of the Polish banking sector was sold to foreign banks. And during the crisis, we faced a huge problem because we had savings, we had very stable macroeconomic policy, and suddenly our savings started to get transferred to Austria or to Ireland, to mother companies. Yeah? So the Polish government started to intervene, although just 2 years ago, 2 years before, said nationality in the banking sector is simply not important, you know. So this was a really radical change in this approach. And another interesting thing: only 6% of assets are in the hands of local small banks. And during the crisis, these international banks in Poland reduced credit expansion at 30%. These small local banks increased at 30% rate, you know, so they reacted as actually we expected and basing on the market rules, you know. So we don't know actually what will be the end of this evolution. However, researchers have a problem now to call the Polish economy to give such a label like LME or CME. You could find labels with Southern European model in Eastern Europe, or liberal market economy, or dependent market economy, because exactly these international companies, they bring capital and they bring skills, you know, but it's still a highly exposed situation. And there is an additional sector. These are small Polish companies, a little bit cut off from this international sector, and they provided the Polish economy the resilience during the crisis, because they do not export too much, they are not indebted, they ignore the banks. And Poland was a star of crisis, but it's a laggard of boom times, we can say, you know, because if you have these small companies, you cannot boom in right times. You can protect your economy against crises, but you might have problems in the future. And we are exactly at the point where we have to make decisions. And I think Brazil will face, or is facing now, the same problem. Thank you very much.
So, Rainer Cattell.
Yes, I have a let's say 3 sort of briefish comments, and I used the papers by Emily and Renato as sort of a taking off points for some sort of future research allies, if you will, within the Spiderweb. And I think what has been sort of the common point of the papers and also of the discussion is the question about state or policy capacity. In a sense, how is this policy capacity or state capacity actually created? I mean, what are the sort of the movers behind various types of capacity? And I think this is indeed for a organization like Spiderweb, I think is one of the key questions to sort of understand, because around this table, we see that we have a sort of a huge, large agreement on policies, what should be done, capital controls and this and that. But much more the key question by now is how can you do it, and how should you do it? How should you go about doing that in poor countries in Eastern Europe, in Latin America, and all of these questions that tend to be all about actually policy capacity. So the policy capacity, in that sense, seems to be in many ways at the center of the discussion. And I would say, or I have basically 3 points. And first of all, I would say that we tend to view policy capacity in a quite static way. I mean, it is either there or not. It's high or low. I mean, World Bank, of course, is very much guilty of that because they have these indices of that, actually. But also, if you look at, and what was, I think, Renato's point in many ways was that even if you look at the varieties of capitalism literature, and if you look at the institutionalism, also in this literature, which is basically heterodox, the capacity is seen as a sort of a static concept. It is what it is. It's sort of there, and it's and I think this is one of the key problems to understand and to actually incorporate into research and to have research that shows how capacity actually evolves over time. Because if you look at real countries or real sectors, capacities change all the time. But we actually don't really have the tools to analyze that. So we have a very static understanding of the state, even, I would say. And I think partially it is methodological. I think it's methodological is because if you look at the heterodox literature, varieties of capitalism, if you look at institutionalism, especially of the 20th century type, we deal mainly with institutions, for instance, labor unions or things like that. We actually rarely go on the level of implementation of various policies. And why implementation is important, I think, came out from Robert's examples about Korea and Taiwan. I mean, even if whatever you agree in trade agreements, you can still do it quite differently. But this is also true, of course, for domestic policies. I mean, if government agrees to support R&D, still doesn't mean that they support R&D or any kind of R&D. They do a specific R&D measures in specific organizations by specific people. And so this is, again, I think that we rarely go on the level of organizations and of people and look how these kind of policies then are actually implemented. And the key, I think, is that implementation gives you the actual feedback. What is happening with this policy? I mean, whether this policy is being taken up by the companies, by the universities, by labor unions, whatever, and how it is actually done also by the organizations. How do the people actually understand this policy? What is it supposed to do? Because also in Robert's examples, if there would have been different people, they would have done probably differently. So it's again, but of course we cannot say that our theoretical sort of conclusion is we should have better people. That's always a good solution, but I mean that's sort of Stalinism in reverse, you know. He said no people, no problems. So we say good people, no problems. So I think we have to sort of move away from this large sort of organizational level or institutional level and go lower and look at the institutional organizational level or level of bureaucrats and see how policies are actually implemented by whom, how this is done, and then I think we can get closer to actually understanding evolution of policy capacity. And I think that leads me to a theoretical point, is to say that policy capacity, I think, is an evolutionary phenomenon. Some forms become dominant than others over time. And so this is something, again, that we really haven't even the tools, I think, to really analyze. We have a very large tool of varieties of capitalism, but this doesn't actually tell us much why, for instance, in Brazil, policy capacity around car industry is changing over time. I mean, this varieties of capitalism literature tells us almost nothing about that. Or it tells us sort of a large trajectories, but not much more. So I think that what we need to sort of to research about is to see and understand that policy capacity or state capacity is an evolutionary phenomenon, and we really don't have actually even a theory of that. And I would say that especially over the last 100 years, basically, the heterodox economics has been standing still. Actually, you can find some sort of evolutionary theory of state capacities in Veblen, I think, and around that time, but not later. And so I think this is one of the key tasks to sort of to develop an evolutionary theory of state capacities and then also to research on them. So this would be my first point. The second point is very much related to that. Is I think that there is again a research avenue that has not been really used that much, and this has to do with the relationships between public organizations, bureaucracies, and economic structure. Again, we have a rather large view, but we haven't really done a how this feedback works in different sectors where there is the structure of the sector is different. So if, for instance, if you have a sector that is dominated by foreign companies and how they relate to public sector organizations, and if you have a sector that is dominated by domestic companies. Because you would assume that there is a different form of capacities are evolving in these sectors, and especially if you add a layer of how these companies are financed, whether they are financed by domestic or foreign savings, domestic development banks and all that. So you create a layer of relationships that we sort of, I think, need to start to understand more in more detail, I think. And a sort of a sectoral capacity studies seem to me a very good way of starting to do that. And I think Spiderweb is very, very well equipped to actually do that. It's probably one of the best networks in the world who can do that. So this would be my second point. And third point, I think, is again we have sort of a very general understanding that over the last 20 years or 30 years, public sector reforms have had an enormous impact on the public sector. The new public management reforms and other neoliberal reforms. So we don't call it anymore new public management because everybody, even in the World Bank and so knows new public management was not good. But we now call it performance management. So we just put a new name on it. But I think again to understand how these performance management systems that are implemented, how these actually influence the policy capacity, and is again something that we really haven't looked at. For instance, if you have a financial regulatory agency and if they have internal performance standards, how these standards, how the hiring practices, promotion practices, who they hire, why they hire, how they coordinate their inner working between departments, how this actually impacts their capacity to deal with capital controls, to have, for instance, also negotiations with the EU or US and so. I think it's again a research avenue that is almost completely not sort of used. And I think again Spiderweb is a network that is very well equipped because there is people who are very good in finance, people who are very good in political science, and in industrial policy and all that. So to put that together, I think would be again a very valuable sort of a research agenda, if you will. So that was my brief 3 points. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rainer. We have 5 minutes. I think would be fair to hear another time, Emily and Renato. I would like only to add one little point addressed to Renato about the political dimension of the development agenda. And thinking about the Brazilian case, I think that would be a point also to our agenda in the Spiderweb, and has to do with this idea of a coalition, underlying political coalition, underlying development strategies. And hearing the discussion here, it came to my mind and thinking about the Brazilian case, came to my mind the following question: how to overcome a coalition supporting policies of consumption and policies of redistributive policies. I'm sorry. How to overcome or how to aggregate this kind of policies to a coalition of investment. Okay, I don't think if I'm wrong and thinking that possibly there is a difference between the two coalitions. A coalition to redistribute and to support consumption policies and a coalition to invest, societal and a political coalition. I think that perhaps Brazil is now facing the challenge of building a different kind of coalition, a coalition to invest and strongly, invest. That's a very quick point I would like to add, and then I will devolve the table to Emily. Would like to answer some points.
Sure, thank you very much. It's a really stimulating set of comments. Perhaps I'll just come back on the few, particularly the ones that Robert raised, because they were directly questions to the empirics. But just also to say, I think several of the points of Renato, this idea of contested frames of reference among elites, I think is a really important one to look at in the kind of vision and to work on that. And also this idea of managing distributive conflicts internally are key for the external, and I think you're right there, because if you basically you negotiate on two levels, as the literature says. You're looking externally, but you've also got to look back home and see what the political ramifications are. So the ability to negotiate on both fronts and the type of coalition that you can develop internally, I think, is crucial for that. So it's an important point. So the questions, directly the ones that Robert raised on the empirics, and thanks for all the examples on Taiwan and Singapore and the kind of idea of covert versus the actual what you agree to on paper versus actually what you do behind the scenes. And we see that a lot in a lot of the studies we've done as well. How much did the EU get from the Caribbean? They got most of what they wanted. The Caribbean negotiated some minor concessions at the margin, but of that long list, they got most. So, for example, one of the bigger things on government procurement, they didn't get access to the government procurement markets, but they got transparency and a commitment to negotiate access in the future. So they pulled back on a few things, but the Caribbean basically agreed to most of it. What's interesting is in Africa and the Pacific, the only issue on the table that was actually signed was trade in goods. So all the services in goods, yeah. So they said there's a rendezvous clause that they will negotiate in future on services, investment, intellectual property, but there's no actual commitment in the current text. So the EU got very little on that. And in the trade in goods, it really depended. So the West Africans and Central Africans, I think the technical capacity there to really eat away at the technical details was less. So they got a lot of the text that was signed was pretty much what the EU put in front of them. In that particular area, but you see the Southern Africans and the Pacific were able, for example, on safeguards to put in stuff on infant industry, so they managed to get a little bit of space to the technical details. The divide and rule tactics were throughout. The EU managed to play the coalitions. They broke down the ACP coalition. They started off negotiating as a single group. They then moved to the regional level, and then the EU was very effective at dividing up the regions. But what was interesting is even at a national level, countries have still pushed back. So you see Ghana, for example, signed on its own a bilateral agreement, or initialed a bilateral agreement. It then postponed and didn't sign and hasn't implemented. So what was interesting for me is in the literature, we rely on coalitions as the main mechanism through which small states can push back. But actually, at least in terms of blocking and evading commitments, a lot was even done at the unilateral level. Thanks very much, Sebastian, as well. I think it's a really good extra case study, and it's nice to see it put in a different context. And there's a lot of food for thought on the details of that. And Ryan, I think the idea of bringing together the kind of policy experts from the economic side and then the sort of political science of actually tracing through is it's a big avenue for research. Thanks for that.
Thank you. Renato, you really have 2 minutes now. I'm serious.
I'm glad, because I don't have too much to say at this point. 2 minutes will be enough. I think I would like to address some of the points that Rainer Cattell raised regarding the notion of how state capacity is created, and the possibility of not seeing state capacity or political capacity in a static way. I think this is precisely one of the points that I was bringing into discussion. Not so much in terms of seeing how capacities evolve over time, because sometimes the way that capacities evolve over time have to do with manners in which a given trajectory, like to bring back to my suggestion in analytical terms, how a given trajectory is either the object of continuity with some gradual changes over time, or on the contrary, in terms of how a given trajectory is actually interrupted or and previously existing structures and bureaucracies or state nuclei of different natures, etc., are done away with. And you mentioned something regarding the way administrative reforms took place. Now, in the case of Brazil, I think one aspect that I pointed out regarding trajectory effects is the continuity of state structures, or the valuing of some Weberian bureaucracies that were kept and were not wiped out by any of these reforms, as they were in other cases, like in the case of Argentina, which is, subject to interruptions and to a number of ruptures over time. So it's a matter of trajectory as well, understanding how continuity takes place, or else interruption, right? Breaking away from previously existing, doing away with the capacity to be cumulative over time. So this is one point, and I agree. I think that we have to pin down, aspects regarding implementation, not only implementation, but prior to that, formulation of how the policies are formulated, how they are implemented, and eventually, and most importantly, how they are followed up, and how coordination is established as part of those capacities as well. And I think Fabiano raises a very interesting aspect, because how do we move from a redistributive coalition to a coalition that's able to support investment? It's about time that something like that should take place in the case of Brazil. I think you are right, but I don't think that neither the redistributive coalition is assured in principle, nor an investment coalition for that matter, because what is at stake is, to come back to contested views, is that you have some elite segments with some preferences that are able to impose those preferences, whereas in other cases that's not actually possible. But to put it in a broader framework, and I rely on that definition very much. I come back to the notion that a state capacity means the extent to which intervention of state agents in existing non-state resources, activities, and interpersonal connections alter existing existing distributions of those resources and interpersonal connections, as well as relations among those distributions. This is Tilly. And he talks about, no process is finished or assured. He talks about democratization as related to the implementation of those capacities, as well as de-democratization, or in other words, the possibility that you could regress. So I think that this is something that has to be investigated in its own in our agenda. And it, in fact, constitutes an aspect of a project that we are developing with IPEA. Yeah. Thank you.
So we have a coffee break now. Thank you very much.
Hein?
A pesquisa, aquela que o Roberto começou um ano antes dessa, que é no nível brasileiro, está vindo com resultados tão incríveis que já chegaram os estudos e a gente está compilando. Tudo bem? E a gente nota que a capacidade de implementação de políticas públicas nos setores varia tanto, devido não só às capacidades do Estado, mas também os pontos de veto, as colisões políticas. Mas isso tem uma
Isso dentro daquele esquema que vocês tinham montado lá.
A gente elegeu 8 políticas envolvidas que estão vendo as capacidades e chegaram já às análises. E assim, por exemplo, você nota a Constituição do Ministério do Desenvolvimento Social, a forma de implementação de políticas sociais, as colisões blocadas, elas diferem muito de políticas de transposição de São Francisco. Isso varia tanto que eu tendo a concordar com o Rainer. Falar de capacidade em geral é muito difícil. Só que você jogar com o nível de abstração lá para cima.
Mas ainda assim, nessa definição que eu acabo de ler, eu acho que é importante, porque é a medida em que intervenções estatais alteram a distribuição de recursos em coisas que não são estatais.
Não são estatais, tá? Pois é, mas isso varia muito.
Claro que sim, mas eu acho que é uma definição ainda assim.
Não, é uma definição.
Que orienta, em geral, equivale tanto para a política de desenvolvimento, chance de dizer, quanto para políticas sociais.
Saiu no jornal isso, acho que o Washington falou um pouquinho disso.
Eu vi o Postman uma intervenção.
Falando que a ênfase na redistribuição deixou de lado um pouquinho a questão do investimento.
Eu vi espetáculo separado.
A capacidade de você não é só ter os recursos, você tem que investir de fato.
Investir de fato.
Aplicar os recursos.
A área de segura, por exemplo, a área de segura
Palec trabalhava tem uma coisa de sabotagem. Agora, como é que você aciona o state capacity para pegar o cara e obrigar o cara? A coisa de sabotagem tem a ver com café.
Tem a ver com corrupção, em outras palavras. Está lá. Tem a ver com extração de recursos. Você está para depois você receber algum retorno
pacote de investimento
para tirar o obstáculo.
Isso. Esse pacote de investimento agora você tem que mudar todas as taxas de retorno.
Passou de 6 para 15. O cara falou essa coisa de Niterói, você fica sabendo coisa da ponte, CCR, Andrade Cotier, e eles acharam 15 um absurdo. O cara falou 10% estava ótimo. Para 15. E o cara também falou que todo mundo da ponte tem depositar direto na Suíça, tem medo. É o advogado respeitou. Isso um engenheiro da universidade, assim, que é meu chefe lá, falou no almoço. É verdade.
Além do fato de você tem.
Não, ainda tem a micropolítica, né? Os financiamentos, as empreiteiras, né? Financiamento desde campanha até o cara.
E ainda tem os obstáculos colocados pela própria burocracia. Eu quero dizer, o TCU, a AGU, o TCU,
É 866, né? É 8 essa lei. Essa lei é 866.
Mas governo agora é tudo SDC, né? Tiraram os investimentos são todos agora para o SDC. É mais fácil.
Não tomou não.
O Acilo agora está todo feliz, hein? Entrou lá no doutorado, tá aqui, tá lá, tá,
I did some work on that before. And then I did study a little, the bureaucracy and the airlines. And so then you can see if things are actually working on the
We also need sort of theoretical framework to understand
Oh, yeah.
what do you research?
Yeah. Now I'm moving to a small city campus near Rio. It's called Barcelona. And then there's an important regional development issue there because there's this huge steel industry. Yeah. And then there are automakers coming to the region too. So there's this process of change going on, and then my project now is on this. So I abandoned it a little bit the airlines and the national agenda to focus a little bit more on regional. But
Why is so large? But in your case, the regional.
yeah,
Many business other countries.
yeah, but it's kind of a laboratory of the national economy too. That's how I'm trying to see things there.
I come here quite often. I've also written a bit about Brazil as well, comparing Brazil actually was very interesting. Because I was typically having a more large long-term studies changed my life. Come here.
What's your department?
We are like school of innovation and stuff. Okay, that's all. Innovation policy. Yeah. Exactly. That's all. Seeing the things are sooner rather than No, it's sector staking and it's too much technology. It's mistaken. Took the study the most of technology. It's MIT. That's how we call it. No, it's exactly the model I like. Theory of technology and depending on the but I'm not so sure if French would be such a Yes, it's sort of
But the people from the different schools and backgrounds, they get along fine.
we have been very carefully building it over 10, 15 years.
Ah, okay, long term, right? So,
We have playing very fresh.
yeah, because we have administration course there. I at least I expected that for to get economics, business administration to work on this kind of agenda. But I don't think they have done a good job so far. It's a few years actually. Yeah. But it's interesting to see that it can work. Maybe not in the short run, but in the long run.
We also need a program. We don't have actually students from Brazil. One of my former students he got a master's degree from
We just approved a master's course there. I don't think we still have problems for international exchange for masters, right? Do you think there are? I'm not sure if there are. Because usually they're more focused at doctoral courses. But if they do have graduation sort of exchange, order less sciences. Yeah, but it's more aimed at technology. Yeah, but the problem is not here. They don't consider our administration students, business students as eligible. Yeah, the bureaucracy. Let's try to discuss it too. Yeah, let's.
I don't know far. I don't have any hotel.
I think I do have one. Portuguese, but the important information is the já sabe onde é que é? Ah, tá.
Imagina, esse é a sua bolsa é essa.
Você faz outras viagens, mas eu, quando eu começo a falar, eu faço um esquema, eu uso a primeira linha do esquema, depois não olho mais nada, não sei mais nada que está escrito no papel.
Ah, não, eu tenho que falar, não. Quando eu participo do debate, não. Tá. Mas quando eu participo do debate, não, mas... Tereza. Cadê a Tereza? Deixa eu botar. Lavínia, você vai participar da minha?
Tem uma discussão muito boa. Vai muito na direção do que o Maurício está discutindo também. Com massa. Não, eu vou lá, daqui a pouco eu vou lá falar. Sempre deixa eu acessar os movimentos. Mas a aproximação, de repente, ele está aqui com uma coisa aí, conversa. Mas não nessa perspectiva de pesquisa dos dados, dele é uma discussão mais teórica, aquele cara que era irmão, André. Foi ele que você viu o artigo sobre. Não, é outro. Quem tá vendo que veio para não. É o outro rapaz. Ele vai perguntar você aqui, você contacta com ele, tá? O André Novo não foi aquele que escreveu o artigo sobre variedade independente de capitalismo? Então, o texto dele a gente usou na introdução do livro, realmente Ah, ele viu? Ah, ótimo. Aham. Ótimo.
Serio, no que hizo para que... Digo, por eso te dije, 3 días, no tiene basura.
Ele tá.
Yo fui al baño ya. ¿Cuánto? 1 hora de diferencia. Sí, ahora. Ah, nosotros tenemos. Vamos a cambiar ahora. Nosotros tenemos. Nosotros sí.
Não comi nada, só tomei chá, que eu tô na vigilância do peso. Acho que vontade, aqueles pães de peso maravilhosos. Essa terra é muito importante.
Vamos chamar?
Vamos. Galo é maior ainda.
Ese negocio es jogo duro, ¿no? 3 días, este negocio aqui. 3 dias, das 9 até as 7.
E depois, fora o curso que vai continuar pela semana
Por isso
dele.
que é jogo duro, né?
Não, lá no Lamas.
Por isso, não, a organização de tudo, não.
Muito bom.
Ajeitar tudo.
Tá bom.
Foi ela.
Ela ainda que se embelém.
Tem que ser rebelei, tá bom. Feito português.
Já na casa ao lado é uma pastelaria que ficou incrível. Uma pastelaria de Belém. Uma coca. Pastel de Belém da falsa.
Ai, meu Deus.
Nata, que são de Belém.
Aí
Entendeu? A gente chama pastel de nata.
você fez uma colocação interessante, não? O fato de que a primeira mesa
Pra ser
não
de
tinha
Belém, tem que
secreto
ser
político, hein?
em Belém.
Então era uma discussão, era como...
As palavras.
Estava todo implícito.
Exatamente.
Tudo era político que estava dizendo lá.
Mas aí, o cara que eu fiz algum comentário.
Falou assim, não, o Brasil pode limpar piscina, mas legal,
momento da pesquisa que você está levando em conta, não? Essa pesquisa. Vocês trabalham com essas 5 dimensões de capacidade estatais que você fala, digamos, de inovação, infraestrutura, política social, agenda internacional, essas cinco também, esses 6, política industrial, inovação, agenda internacional, infraestrutura, também isso. Agora tem show no Chile, hicimos um debate, um encontro no ano passado, sobre capacidades estatais. Eles debataram. O debate era sobre conceituação e verificação empírica do conceito. Interessante, porque tem um monte de pessoas discutindo. Aí, o último jornal, eu posso te mandar. Se dá para acessar a internet, ou não sei se eu posso acessar porque eu tenho acesso livre. Mas eu te mando os artigos todos porque eu vou colocar porque o Robert Wade falou sobre capacidades, aí tem essa definição. Tem outro trabalho que eu tenho visto de um educador, um estudante que se orientou sobre capacidades políticas e capacidades burocráticas. Capacidade de Estado, políticas e burocráticas. Uma tese de doutorado.
Madame, está supervisando.
É um cara que domine, não sei se foi domine, não, deixa aí. Não é esse. É um estudante, ele fala que foi estudante. Estou confundido, que ele fala capacidades políticas e capacidades burocráticas. Essas duas dimensões. Faz essa distinção. Então faz, levanta essa uma tipologia para tentar analisar, digamos. Então, você pode ter as duas, tem uma delas, uma só delas. Então isso depende, capacidade burocrática e capacidade política. Então, o que tem que ser dito é que a grande diferença hoje na América Latina, essa nova governance que nós temos, é uma governance construída muito sobre capacidades políticas. E isso tem a ver também que a esquerda pegou o viés do neocorporativismo, digamos, aunque esqueceu em parte de fato a compreensão, até um neocorporativismo maior, não é? Porque ele permite, eu trabalhei diretamente na Previdência Social, o debate de articulação, e essa construção institucional, porque tem muitas áreas da agenda que são novas. A diferença é que não é uma representação liberal exclusiva a través do Parlamento. Es una articulación, la izquierda monta áreas.
Celina,
Eu aprendi com o Renato.
chama todo mundo. Começa.
Duas convocações, uma em português, vamos começar, uma em inglês, it's time to get started.
Tá bom.
Por favor, André Carvalhal, Eduardo Diniz e Eduardo Barbosa. Estão aqui.
Ué, isso aqui não desliga, não?
So here you are.
Ah,
Não, tá ligado.
alô.
Agora a Ana.
Alô.
A Ana Jaguaribe já foi?
Foi que ela foi para casa.
Então é depois. É 7.
Mrs. President. Can I start?
Yes, please. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, my name is Celina. I'm going to chair this round table this afternoon, and I'd like to take advantage of being part of the morning session and the afternoon session, and just brief words about it. I would say if a person from Mars would arrive here and attended the morning session and the afternoon session, would probably think that was a completely different workshop with different participants. Well, in the morning we had very specific topics and focus of research agenda, trade, financial markets, and so on. And whereas in the afternoon it was a more broad agenda. In the morning, we had the language of the so-called market. In the afternoon, we had just, to make it more simple, varieties of capitalism. In the morning, we were called to pay attention to politics, but as Renato mentioned, in a very broad way. In the in the afternoon, we were called to not only that politics matter, but rulers matter, as was the word used by Robert Wade. Um, and finally, in the morning, we had not only very specific topics, very clear research agenda, but it seemed to me at least that the presenters and the participants of the roundtable were very much sure of their answers to the economic constraints that we are facing. Whereas in the afternoon was, so far at least, was very different. We had more questions. More questions were raised than the proposed definitive answers to the problems we are facing. I think, of course, everybody's going to participate in the roundtable. You are free to say whatever you want, as long as now keeping the tradition, 3 minutes, please. But taking also the word trajectory that Renato used, I think that two things came out from our afternoon session. The first one is it possible, or how we can start to establish a dialogue between political scientists and economists, and making, I think, clear that at least for us political scientists, we are not dealing here with orthodox economists, but non-orthodox economists, which means that this dialogue may be easier to to carry on. And the second thing is that a theme cut across most of the presentations, and it was the theme of state capacity. And maybe this is something that can put us together, political scientists and economists. But here I think we need a canvas, as Robert Wade called us our attention. If we are going to be united by the concept of state capacity, we need to, let's say, uniformize our concept. As he said, state capacity is legal capacity, is broadly and very important, the capacity of raise revenue, or bureaucratic capacity is not, broadly speaking, unless, of course, we're talking about the concept in a free way, why countries lose or gain. Okay, that's it. So it's open.
Two general comments, in fact, that are more both about the discussion and food for thought for Anna Segli and the organization of the school. I mean, we heard repeatedly that developing countries resist in various ways free trade agreement, and sometimes they accept it at gunpoint. Now, either all the government in developing countries are idiots, or they are completely prisoners of the lobbies. Or third, maybe they are not very competent, but they have the intuitive feeling that free trade is a luxury for the winners more than anything else. I think it is important, having in mind the school then, to have a theory have theories, and there are around. I mean, even in this room, there are people that contributed to it. Bob Wade, myself, Hajun Chang outside, that support the notion that comparative advantages in the development process are a very poor or even perverse guidance to development, and that free trade might be an obstacle to any type of long-term infant industry. And this possibly is part of the intuition, even if not well developed by many negotiators, and not very skillfully argued by many negotiators. It is also true that there are lobbies around, and there are lobbies that are very powerful, for example, in areas where comparative advantage should rule, like agriculture. And agriculture is the place where you've got the least free trade. Now, but the complement to the argument on the fact that one should look much more at absolute advantages and the quality of specialization, the quality of production in terms of innovative opportunities and demand elasticities, rather than sheer comparative advantages. And this, I think, should be one of the major topics of the school, because people need to be trained in, broadly speaking, technology gap theory of international trade. This, of course, to repeat, does not leave out the possibility of lobbying, special interest, and this is another major topic that emerged this afternoon, is how, to paraphrase Allison book, the old Allison book on the Cuban crisis, how decisions happen. You call it the evolution of policy capacities, and the way blocks, hegemonic blocks, are built. I mean, one would like to understand how developmental states emerged or did not emerge. I mean, the anatomy of the developmental state should be both on the research side and on the teaching side another major building block. I stop here.
Thank you, Andreas Nölke. I would like to make 3 points, if I have the time, one on Emily and 2 on Renato. My first point, I would like to draw the 2 presentations a bit more together, because there was a light linkage about state capacity, about negotiating trade agreements, but I think there's potentially a much stronger link between the 2 presentations. If you take a somewhat broader understanding of state or institutional capacity, maybe in the field of, let's say, policy space for maneuver, or the types of policies that are still available to you. And that is linked to something, that's also my question to Emily, to the so-called Singapore issues, or WTO plus issues, or deep integration, or next generation, however you call it. You very briefly mentioned it in your presentation that this was part of the negotiations, and luckily, in empirical terms, the developing countries apparently did not take on board much of this. I think this is extremely dangerous, and Robert already mentioned the case of capital controls, which is part of this agenda, and certainly emerging markets should, as we discussed in the morning, not accept these kind of prescriptions. Another thing is competition policy, which is extremely important for emerging markets, for catch-up processes so far. And I would strongly advise against taking over, let's say, European Union or US competition policy. Or intellectual property rights, also something that countries that are catching up should be very careful of adopting European Union prescriptions. So here I would have a broader perspective of, let's say, institutional state capacity, the ability to still implement these kind of policies. And that's more than, let's say, the administrative thing that you can negotiate, but that you kind of oppose these kind of the regulations. And I think Sebastian has given an excellent point what happened to Central and Eastern Europe. In the context of the acquis communautaire, they had to take on all of these policies. This was deep integration, or WTO plus times 10. And we have seen what happened to these economies. Of course, they have a fairly high standard of living, but as Sebastian pointed out, they are very much dependent in terms of capital. They are dominated by German, Austrian, and so on multinational companies. So I would strongly emphasize the need to keep some kind of state capacity in refusing these policies. And my first point to Renato is I would strongly support your take on state capacity, and maybe defend you a bit against Reiner's point, because often when I hear about state capacity from people working in public administration or economists, it has this kind of technocratic character. It's about, you know, setting up nice procedures, nice institutions, and you train the people and so on. Yesterday, for example, I was doing interviews in Brasilia with an agency called ABDI, some kind of industrial development agency, and they told me all kinds of things and the nice governance structures they are setting up. And I think that this is all important, and I think that's I think a very important agency. But what I consider more important for state capacity is what Renato mentioned is this issue of settlement of conflicts between competing interests, competing elites, and with somewhat more Marxist terminology, I would say between different class interests or class fractions. And in Brazil, of course, you have agricultural interests, industry, labor units, and so on. And I think we can only understand state capacity if we really take into account what Roberto says, this kind of elite settlements, that they have the ability of come up with some kind of national development project. And we can see, for example, in South Africa that they are unable to, and it's doing a lot of harm to the South African economy. China is more successful. India, maybe this is breaking down at the moment. So I would strengthen your more political point on this, and not so much the technocratic administrative point. And the last point I would like to make is also to support you in using this kind of varieties of capitalism approach for teaching in the school. And I think this notion of institutional complementarities that you mentioned is exactly something that can be extremely helpful for students, because it highlights the interdependencies between different policies. And much policy advice, and again, sorry for this small aggression, many economists, for example, have this single focus, let's say, on, innovation or education or capital provision and so on. But this notion of institutional complementarity highlights the complexity between different issue areas, and that you have to address several issues at once. Let me just give you a quick example, not to be so abstract. The German system of vocational training, that is something that is being applauded everywhere in the world. It's been exported for 30 years by German Development Corporation, but it hardly works. It works on a small scale, but it doesn't. No country, except maybe Austria, has been able to come up with a similar system. And the notion of institutional complementarities highlights why this is the case. For this system to work, you need powerful labor unions that are involved in this scheme. You need powerful employer associations. You need a system of corporate governance and corporate finance where companies take long-term strategies, so they employ long-term employment relations. And of course, you need a state that is supporting this. And this concept derived from varieties of capitalism, I think, is very useful. And if you use this in teaching in this school, I think this can be very useful. Thank you.
I would like to move a little bit away from the discussion considering financial crisis and economic policies to move a little bit further towards the more broad concept of development. And in this case, I will analyze state capacity considering governance and the issue of climate change that you mentioned before, and Kadu as well. I guess there is a issue that's underestimated in the discussion, which is the issue of sustainable development. And I will mention some points that perhaps will be having quite a lot of impact behind the scene, and it's not very much considered. The first one is the discussion about the ethical crisis, which means the whole rethinking about development, considering social basis and environmental impacts and so on. It's obvious, but it will impact as well the institutional capacity building strategies. The other point, especially considering the green economy agreements after Rio +20 and the whole set of points about the new indicators of sustainable development to be issued from 2015. The second point is the geopolitical context. I guess if you consider, for instance, new natural resource assets and potential in development, it means that new power is going to raise, and we can see it very, very well in the Convention of Climate Change and the Biodiversity Convention as well, which implies new arrangement and new coalitions among countries. For instance, the poor developing countries which are working together to block international decisions. And for instance, Brazil is a leadership in both discussions right now, and the countries like Madagascar is achieving a very important role in international negotiation. And it's also important to consider, for instance, the question of immigration related to environmental change and impacts. And new actors and new powers, for instance, the international NGOs, and how do they influence state institutions and also influence state capacity building in Brazil and Latin American countries and African countries. NGOs like Conservation International, WWF, they have almost the same power as state agencies. And the other thing is that if you consider, for instance, the agreement about sustainable development indicators to be placed in movement from 2015, the state agencies are not well adapted to it. And there are two concepts that are very much discussed in environmental issues, which is resilience and adaptation. And considering Latin American countries, African countries, and I guess less Asian institutions, they are very, very much framed to work in political issues which are very much fragmented. So I think we have to work in Spiderweb, the idea of transversality more than any time before. Yes.
I'm going to speak in Portuguese, can I? So, dois pontos que eu queria destacar é que dois conceitos que permeiam esse debate, que eu acho que a gente precisa trabalhar de uma maneira mais esclarecer melhor, né? Primeiro é a questão de capacidades estatais, como Rainer colocou. Eu acho que quando você trabalha no nível médio, né, a gente vê que as capacidades do Estado em implementar políticas públicas, elas variam bastante, né? Nós, no IPEA, estamos terminando uma pesquisa agora sobre várias políticas desenvolvimentistas, né? E a gente percebe que a capacidade do Estado brasileiro, por exemplo, implementar a política social, ela é muito mais forte do que, por exemplo, em tocar um programa de obras e investimentos em infraestrutura. Então, isso tem tudo a ver com a questão não só da história, mas como as colisões políticas, os interesses que estão em torno em cada um desses projetos e o caráter das políticas distributivas, políticas redistributivas, etc. Então, tomar cuidado um pouco com esse conceito, porque a capacidade do Estado pode virar aquele termo polissêmico, né, e acaba querendo dizer tudo e que não diz nada. Então, eu acho que a sugestão do Rainer em trabalhar com a questão do policy implementation, né, policy capacity, seria uma chave para a gente começar a trabalhar isso. E a segunda é a questão de estratégia de desenvolvimento, elites e coalizões de suporte. O Renato fala muito isso. E eu não sei se esse termo, pensando no Brasil de hoje, como trabalhar com isso, porque numa ordem democrática, né, em onde existem vários pontos de veto e numa democracia, no caso brasileiro, cada vez mais pluralista, se quando a gente está falando de estratégia de desenvolvimento, né, um projeto de elites e colisões de suporte, em que maneira a gente está deixando de lado o conflito, né, e o conflito ele é inerente a todo o processo democrático. E o conflito também ele varia com relação à política. Então, por exemplo, ligando com a questão da capacidade do Estado, a política social brasileira, né, que é bem um caso de sucesso, digamos assim, foi montado de forma rápida, implementada de forma rápida, você tem pouquíssimos pontos de veto, né, e pouco conflito. Agora, no nosso caso da política energética, de construir as grandes usinas, né, de Belo Monte, por exemplo, a enormidade de conflito que existe isso, né, as minorias, os índios, o Ministério Público, enfim, todas as instituições democráticas. Quer dizer, às vezes uma pessoa ela pode estar numa mesma, digamos, no espectro político, mas dependendo a política que você trabalha, elas vão estar em campos diferentes. Então, como falar em coalizão, né, e estratégia de desenvolvimento nesse ambiente político? Então, isso seria um ponto que eu acho que a escola tem que trabalhar melhor esses referenciais.
Thank you. I just want to put around the table some thoughts about the current conjuncture which we are in. Basically, this would also be a link between the morning and now. You see, we are in the midst of a situation where if you take the global economy, there is an insufficiency of aggregate demand for goods. This has an immediate problem, namely we know that the bubble has collapsed, the housing bubble, which has really plunged the world into a crisis. But this also has a long-term problem. The very fact that the capitalist economies now require bubbles to sustain growth is itself symptomatic of the kind of structural problem that we are in. Now, I do not see any immediate solution either to the structural problem or even to the immediate problem. I think putting in greater liquidity into the world economy does not help because monetary policy has proved to be ineffective. No individual country is in a position to provide a fiscal stimulus. The kind of idea which Keynes had in 1930s in the context of the Great Depression of a coordinated fiscal stimulus is not happening. It's not on the agenda. As a result, I think many of the countries, especially of the third world, including countries like India and China, possibly Brazil, they just have to adopt an alternative trajectory. In the case of China, there is greater awareness of it because China itself is talking in terms of moving away from the earlier trajectory of basing themselves entirely on export into one where there is going to be much greater emphasis on the domestic market and especially on domestic consumption. This morning we were talking about whether China's exchange rate is something which is getting appreciated. As a matter of fact, an implicit way of appreciating the exchange rate is to raise the real wages, and the Chinese have been doing that quite systematically in the more recent period, though my own feeling is what they have done is not enough. You would need a substantial enlargement of government expenditure, particularly on welfare projects in rural areas. In the case of a country like India, where the growth itself, when it was happening high growth, was still accompanied by substantial increases in economic inequalities and greater hunger for a larger number of people. The fact that the crisis is going to hit us is something which is of great seriousness. And of course here, the transition to an alternative would be even more difficult. In the case of China, because they have a current account surplus, they can make a transition without any fear of capital flight. In the case of a country like India, where you have very substantial current account deficits, and the government is desperately trying to woo finance to come into the country to sustain this deficit, if you have a capital flight because of a change of trajectory, then of course it will be quite serious. So I think delinking in the sense of capital controls, not just that, we actually control, but I mean, we pretend we are not controlling, but actually controlling and also pretending that we are controlling, both would become necessary. You can't do it by stealth. I mean, I think a fairly serious situation is arising. Now, I think on the other hand, this change of trajectory, and here I agree with Renato, is something which would really require a change in the social support for it. I mean, my point is that when we talk about state capacity, not only is it the case, as Rainer says, that state capacity keeps changing or evolves over time, but state capacity is always differentiated. There is a capacity to adopt some policies, but not others. And the point is, which policies state capacity is good at adopting depends on the social support or the class support for those kinds of policies. And I suspect that in the years to come, the kind of the way the crisis is going to hit us in the current conjuncture, and is already hitting a number of third world countries as it persists, is something that is going to also generate the kind of class support for the alternative trajectory and develop state capacity in specific directions.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. I want to speak in Portuguese. No primeiro momento, eu gostaria de concordar com as duas exposições de Emily Jones e Renato Boschi. A primeira coisa, em relação à exposição de Emily Jones, eu acho que o fato de ter salientado que tem diferentes trajetórias nos resultados do processo de negociação é um fato relevante. Não tem uma trajetória só. Isso acho que tem relação com a consideração do Renato, de que temos que levar em conta a trajetória, mas temos que ter em conta que não é uma forma determinística esse assunto. Outro assunto é, teoricamente, que foi considerado o fato da importância de levar em conta a estrutura, a diferenciação estrutural, não? Que todos nós sabemos, não só o tamanho, não é o pequeno país e o grande país, sino diferentes condições de recursos de poder estrutural, mas também levar em conta o processo. Tomar em conta o patamar como foi feito e o patamar nacional. Acrescentar o fato de a importância que na teoria política não é de hoje, não é Peter Halls, é bem de longe a importância das ideias. Por isso uma escola desse tipo é relevante, não é? E pode fazer a diferença. Outro assunto em relação às capacidades estatais, só concordando com as coisas que têm sido ditas, é o fato de que por um lado está a capacidade burocrática e por outro lado a capacidade política. E acho que a grande diferença que nós temos agora nessa nossa nova América Latina é a capacidade política. Então temos muitas experiências, muitas áreas que têm sido construído uma capacidade nova de articulação, de ampliação. Também tem a ver com essa tradição importante que resgatou, eu aprendi há muitos anos atrás com o Renato, do neocorporatismo, do pensamento de Philip Schmitter, e tem muito que ver a isso. Talvez vá além disso hoje, porque hoje temos uma nova sociedade, não? Mas mesmo assim, acho que tem muito a ver com esse assunto, e isso é muito importante ser estudado. Em relação ao trabalho da Emily, uma coisa que eu achei que está implícita teoricamente também, que acho que é bem relevante também para avaliar e analisar processos, é a teoria da negociação. Ou seja, a teoria da negociação está muito clara aí, digamos, não é? O fato de ver o longo prazo, o curto prazo, a proatividade, se faz ou não a diferença, a conceptualização da existência ou não de alternativas. Eu acho que isso é bem relevante. Em relação à teoria e à teorização do variedades de capitalismo, eu acho que tem um implícito nesta conversa de hoje nessa escola que vocês estão criando, que não todos nós estamos criando aqui, é o implícito de que dentro das opções tem uma opção que é o capitalismo liberal e outra opção é o capitalismo coordenado. Dentro do capitalismo coordenado temos diferentes opções, não é? A opção mais continental e a opção mais social-democrata. Mas também tem a opção liberal, não é? Mesmo que eu acho, do meu ponto de vista, essa opção na América Latina tem fracassado politicamente. Isso é uma coisa que é bem clara. Só duas coisas para fechar. Uma coisa que me fez lembrar do trabalho de Emily, eu já falei com ela pessoalmente, é o processo de negociação do Tratado de Livre Comércio entre o Uruguai e os Estados Unidos. Aí temos duas teses doutorais nos Estados Unidos. Não temos muito trabalho em economia política nessa área, mas esses trabalhos mostram bem, e um dos fatores que salientam é as restrições, as limitações institucionais no processo de integração regional. Então, não sei se o fato acho que talvez nesse ponto Robert Wade tem salientado esse ponto, a importância do regional no processo de negociação entre a União Europeia e os países. E, finalmente, só para fechar, gostaria de contar uma pequena história. Conto. Nos anos 50 e 60, nós discutimos na América Latina o desenvolvimentismo, não? Todo mundo, nesse momento, estava querendo ser economista. Mas nos 60 e nos 70, começamos a discutir o dependentismo. E nesse momento, todo mundo passou a querer ser sociólogo. Todo mundo queria ser sociólogo. Nos 80, depois da dura ditadura na América Latina, veio a democracia. Aí todo mundo de nós começamos a pensar que é uma boa ideia ser cientista político, no meu caso. Depois da luta nas ruas, acabamos na ciência política. E, finalmente, hoje estamos aqui, brasileiros, uruguaios, pessoas do mundo todo, pensando em um novo desenvolvimentismo. Nós necessitamos um novo desenvolvimentismo. Eu acho que todos estamos concordando aqui, e isso é bem importante, que esse enfoque, esse novo desenvolvimentismo, vai ser um novo desenvolvimentismo baseado no conhecimento interdisciplinar. Só isso.
Wade.
I would like to say something a bit more about the evolution of policy capacity or state capacity more generally, and to get more specific below the proposition that Prabhat Patnaik made, which is that state capacity has to be differentiated, that state may be good at some things and bad at others, and that this depends upon the degree of class support. In terms of industrial policy, I just want to draw your attention to a common problem of actually not just industrial policy agencies, but also of development banks. And I want to end with a question about our esteemed host organization, namely BENDES. But I will begin by talking about Taiwan. Any industrial policy agency or development bank, for that matter, has to deal with the question of how to keep the staff of the organization up to date in terms of expertise and also highly motivated. Taiwan, from the 1950s onwards, had a body called the Industrial Development Bureau, which was about 150 engineers, and their job was divided into sector teams. Each member of each sector team had to spend several days a month out visiting factories, visiting firms, to bring knowledge of the outside world to the firms and to bring knowledge of the firms and the factory floor into the center where the big industrial policy decisions were made. So there's a two-way communication. And these Industrial Development Bureau officials acted something like agricultural extension agents, but of course they were working in industry. And if you want to understand how it was that Taiwan went from a very poor country in the 1950s to right up near the world frontier in many technological fields, then the role of these industrial extension agents is, I think, really important. In other words, it's not just the top level planning and coordination that matters. It's what happens at this kind of grassroots level. But any organization of this kind faces a problem of how to keep its staff up to date and highly motivated. And from time to time, the most senior people realized that parts of the Industrial Development Bureau teams had gone to sleep, or they were getting very old and they didn't know what they were talking about. They were far out of touch. And so what they did, and this was a typical kind of innovation, they created ad hoc task forces, and members of the task forces could be recruited without having to go through the Chinese civil service examination, which all members of the Industrial Development Bureau had to go through. They could recruit new PhDs from MIT, bring them in and get them working in a concerted way, maybe 20 or 30 people working on automation or working on a plan for the automobile parts industry or some parts of electronics. So they had these sort of satellite task forces which were much more flexible and which existed in some kind of tension with the core staff of the Industrial Development Bureau, but in this kind of way, I mean, it looked unsatisfactory on an organizational chart, but they managed to make it work. They drove through this constant nudging of firms in many sectors to keep upgrading, to keep exporting, to keep linking up with multinational corporations in their value chains, and so on and so on. So that's one kind of way that Taiwan did it. It's a general, there's a general question behind it of how any industrial policy agency or development bank can handle this problem. So that brings me to Bendes. My understanding is that somehow or other, but this is just my understanding, Bendes has managed to solve this problem, but I think not by, for example, having these ad hoc task forces of people who are really outside Bendes and who are kind of going around Bendes. Somehow or other, Bendes has managed to keep a staff rejuvenating itself. And so I wonder if before we finish this conference on Friday, whether it might be possible for somebody at Bendes to talk about, and in an honest way, because there are lots of conflicts, and if you have to get rid of people or you have to bypass people. How has it been done in Bendes to keep these people on their toes?
Liliana.
I'm coming in with a little bit of a different point because my work is on regenerative medicine and stem cell research, but I think it's a good example of something that where you can see how state capacity works and what happens in a new developmentalist model. So in a new developmentalist model, like Renato was defining and Elie Diniz, for Brazil, I think it's very important to see that, in my opinion, that the social inclusion that takes place is basically led by the market in the sense of they're included as consumers, also, of course, within social policy, but not so much as actors, active actors, where the civil society is organized. So I come back to this point in relation to development and to state capacity to see how to bring in perhaps to our interests in this web, the idea of how social beliefs take a long time to be included into institutions and how this has a negative impact sometimes on state capacity. For example, in my research, I found out it was all the consultation processes that were done in this very new area were quite formal and related some epistemic communities were not wide enough, and this has a say into the implementation of policy. So then policy can't be implemented in certain areas. For example, Anvisa had great difficulties in implementing one, what they call CIS embryo, which is a kind of bank where you count the number of embryos that you're going to use in this specific area of stem cell research, where only 30% of assisted reproductive clinics informed, even though it was a legal issue to inform about it. So what happens in the community, in the scientific community, is that they have taken the lead, but sometimes they don't have the information on it. So coming back to Reiner's points, I think it's very important to do a very specific empirical research on certain topics of the way civil society and other organizations of civil society are included or not into this way of thinking within the elites, and as you said, uncontested frames within the elites, but taking into consideration the opinion of different, of wider actors, because we're talking of degrees of democracy in some way. And if you compare, because my work is comparative international, if you compare to other countries, the importance that, for example, the Stem Cell Coalition in the States had in setting up this area, the organization of the participation of charities, for example, in 30% in the UK, to finance this area and coordinate this with the state, has much more relevance. And a lot of that has to do with the organization of civil society, how it is brought into policy, and how and the way, and not only brought into policy, but the way the policy is implemented. Because if you have multicultural beliefs that have to be have to reach a certain consensus, and there is, as you said, there is class difficulties within class power and differences between groups, interest groups, then it's very important to see how you can bring in a more pluralistic way, analyze the different policy dimensions. And I think this area is particularly important because it's considered a strategic area of national interest, not only in the UK or the US, but here also within science and technology policy. So, and from this evolves the kind of regulation you're going to have, and regulation, because I think nobody brought up so much the question of regulation, but regulation is going to assure in some way, the way of competition of these countries in the international market. Okay.
Thank you, Inês.
Just a few suggestions for the school. I thought about a school beginning from where we didn't reach yet, beginning from our lack of knowledge, beginning a new guy, a new researcher, someone we don't know which he will be, because it's a new thing. It's to link politics and economists. And so this matters with order and some kind of things we don't know yet which will be. So we are still in politics in the world of physiocrats. The order physiocrats invented, they were able to speak about economics and politics together. They had this kind of capacity. And since then, we went apart, politics and economics. And still a guy like Schumpeter was not able to make the connection between freedom, liberty, or whatever, and riches, the development. So my suggestion is that, of course, our capacities are important, but that the future student should be a new person, completely different from us, that should understand that the problem is not solved, so he has to solve the problem. We did our job, we have our specialities, but the new school should do the job itself. The students should put the problems that they will solve, and not us. That's my suggestion.
Thank you. Albert?
Well, I just had a few thoughts coming from my experience in China. China's leadership and state capacity, of course, is a corporate structure. The ownership is the Communist Party, and it then appoints management in the form of the State Council. So there's quite a separation from the decision makers to the grassroots political process. And you could say, well, it's not even democratic, so there's no real transfer here. But it gives us a goal, I think, which is sort of economic leadership, institutional leadership, where you have a body that has the capacity to make long-term decisions and finance them without having to be pulled back and to somehow be aloof a bit from the short-term battles in the local political scene. And so, you know, what comes to mind, for example, is the crisis in the early 20th century in the United States, financial crisis that led to constitutional revision that allowed an income tax, which became a huge strengthening of American capacity in terms of revenue management. And so the question is, what kind of constitutional change might take place in more democratic governments that would give them institutions in the economic sphere? For example, not in the legal sphere, you have a Supreme Court, perhaps, that is aloof, has lifetime jurisdiction, doesn't have to be worried about re-election, and can make decisions based on some very broad principles. In the economic sphere, then, of course, because money is part of it, it becomes quite difficult. So, I mean, for example, one of the proposals in the United States to get around this problem now is an infrastructure bank, which is basically trying to create what Brazil and China already have in terms of their development banks. But is there some way to generate, I like to sort of think of Machiavelli, who, studying the Roman republics and trying to design a republic for Florence, said you need institutions that represent the different special interests, or else it will fall apart. But one special interest is that of the whole population for the long term, as opposed to the problems for the short term. And you also have the notion that legal systems, China, people are struggling. There's an NYU professor friend of mine who says and writes, you know, so many development people say the rule of law is absolutely critical, but then they ignore the fact that China has had quite successful development without the rule of law as we would define it. So what's happening there, and he points to a lot of the problems with the rigidities of the rule of law that block development, and you need an authority then that can sort of be the adult in charge of the situation and say, no, here's what we have to do now, and solve the problem in a much more practical way. And this happened in the Chinese case when they had to stimulate the economy after the crash of Lehman Brothers and their own sort of tightening of the economy throughout 2008. They had to break all kinds of laws about supporting local government platforms for fiscal, for financing of infrastructure that were forbidden from taking loans of that kind. But they did it anyway because it was a kind of a crisis time, a solution to bring them out of a double problem of the loss of confidence in the crisis struck, but also their own excessive tightening of the economy to defeat the inflation of 2007. And so they broke the law. But how do you build sort of an adult institution that can deal in the long term and have resources? And it's a goal for us to have. What does our capacity have to accomplish? It has to accomplish leadership as an institution and not rely on an individual, but to say that because of the body's charter and because of the resources that it has, it can accomplish the kinds of decisions that we need. And so the state, we could say, well, no, China's not a good example because it's not a democracy. It's just sort of this totally autocratic system. But it's not. If you look at the feedback in it from a number of loops and participatory sort of things, of course, it has a long way to go. But I'm just saying as a goal, that leadership capability as an institution is something that we might like to try to do. And I was a quick comment on the question about how do we balance between the redistributive function on the one hand and an investment function on the other. And I'm not sure you have to choose. If you can invest in ways that provide income for the lower income groups, and particularly the construction jobs and a whole range of things, which is what a larger scale of infrastructure investment does, then you can perhaps accomplish both and not be stuck with a choice.
Okay. Thank you. Ana Célia.
I like it very much, the observation made by Rainer Kattel, that state capacity is an evolutionary phenomenon. And I understood this as it has path dependency and has a lot of learning in the process of gaining state capacity. But it can be also, I mean, we can suggest that it's also an institutionalist phenomena in the sense that some institutions are imbued in the state capacity. For instance, Brazil have fight inflation. Several measures, several mechanisms were already inbuilt. So it's also an institutionalist, it has an institutionalist dimension. This inbuilt institutional capacity can be very important. I think that this inbuilt capacity, what is lacking is this inbuilt capacity in terms of strategic thinking. I cannot see any strategic I cannot see the process of gaining state capacity in strategic thinking. And this is really the lack of state capacity that is making a lot of difference. And in this sense, the observation that power coalitions are important, this has a lot to do with the strategic thinking. And I come back to the idea that conventions, in the sense of shared beliefs, are very important to save coalitions, political coalitions. If you have the conventions, if you have the shared beliefs, then you really don't need that much political coalitions to implement some policies or some strategies in the sense. So for strategic thinking, we also need conventions, shared beliefs, that save the political process of gaining these power coalitions.
Thank you. Inácio.
I will speak in Portuguese. Eu penso que desse nosso debate aqui, alguns trade-offs podem ser identificados e, a partir deles, é possível apontar alguns temas a serem trabalhados na agenda de pesquisa da escola, né? Uma coisa importante é a afirmação da nação, do Estado-nação, a sua projeção externa, tanto no plano econômico, né, da participação competitiva no mercado mundial, e as pressões que tanto e a projeção política, como especialmente países da dimensão do Brasil, e as pressões que interna e externamente trabalham em direção contrária. Hoje mesmo, nos jornais brasileiros, tem sido apontado que o Brasil deveria abandonar estratégias tipo construção do Mercosul, ou mesmo insistir ou colocar muito peso no G20 e trabalhar mais na construção de acordos bilaterais. Boa parte dos comentaristas, vamos dizer assim, à esquerda, tendem a achar que isso enfraquece o país como protagonista no cenário internacional, né? Enfim, como que, numa construção institucional, você pode lidar com essa dupla, esse trade-off, projetar-se externamente e resistir a pressões tanto que vêm de fora quanto de grupos que internamente trabalham para uma inserção, digamos assim, mais passiva. Outro tema que apareceu em várias intervenções aqui foi aquele que opõe a construção de uma democracia partidária, competitiva, como aquela que o Brasil definiu construir a partir de 1988, digamos assim, e a definição de projetos de longo prazo, né, que ultrapassem o período dos governos. O Antônio Barros de Castro falava que, com a descoberta do pré-sal, o Brasil tem uma trégua de 15 a 20 anos para resolver grandes questões da sua agenda, implementar um projeto de desenvolvimento sem cair no dilema recorrente do estrangulamento do balanço de pagamentos, né? Nós estaríamos livres durante 15, 20 anos desse dilema. Evidentemente que determinadas escolhas políticas podem colocar isso, digamos, a perder, se a agenda não for essa, se for nos fazer um país de rentiers, né? Se for estimular apenas o consumo e após essa trégua, nós atolarmos a nossa vaca holandesa em algum brejo do sertão brasileiro. Então, o que a experiência de diferentes países pode nos dizer e o que podemos construir para compatibilizar a construção, a definição de projetos de longo prazo com a permanência de um jogo eleitoral e partidário, que é um valor também que queremos preservar, né? Essa é mais uma agenda importante. Há países que fizeram isso, né? Enfim, as capacidades estatais. Foi salientado aqui a capacidade evolui, que a capacidade tem uma dimensão burocrática e, simultaneamente, uma dimensão política, né, de coordenação, digamos, interestatal, intraestatal, e também exige sustentação política e coordenação entre os atores, digamos assim, sem a participação dos quais uma política não se implementa. Por exemplo, política industrial. O governo adotou várias medidas aí, reduziu conta de energia, reduziu a taxa de juro, levou o câmbio a quase $2, e estamos toda hora dizendo por que os empresários não investem, né? Nós não podemos mandar prendê-los e obrigá-los a investir. Enfim, um ponto que eu queria salientar, enfim, é que a capacidade, ela, além de variar no tempo e em relação às políticas, é o caso de se pensar como agenda nossa, que ela varia também, e não é absolutamente compartilhado entre nós, mas ela varia também conforme a configuração institucional na relação das empresas com seus dilemas de coordenação, né? Para que a gente não reduza a construção institucional ligada à edificação de determinadas capacidades, à definição apenas e simplesmente de algumas melhores práticas, fazendo às avessas um mesmo esforço intelectual que nós criticávamos nas proposições das agências multilaterais, né, em relação, por exemplo, ao consenso de Washington. Quer dizer, países como os Estados Unidos não criaram agências centrais de coordenação e nem formas de colaboração Estado-empresariado, como frequentemente é apontado como a melhor prática para implementar política industrial. Entretanto, tem coordenação através das compras governamentais, etc., né? Em que medida a gente vai calibrar a nossa formulação sobre as melhores instituições com a trajetória que torna possível esta ou aquela reforma institucional, mas não todas. Porque o esforço de reformar, às vezes, ele é muito custoso e se a gente não presta atenção aos legados, né? Aos legados e às resistências existentes, enfim, pode, no limite, dar com os burros na água. É isso.
Obrigada. Eduardo.
Eu vou falar em português e inglês. No, because it's just a question for Professor Albert that you began by saying that, if I understood, China as a corporatist was, and so in what sense you mean that?
Well, in the sense that if you have a corporate management, you have ownership that has a board of directors, and the board of directors then selects management, and there can be overlap in personnel, and the performance of the one is reviewed by the other and adjusted over longer periods of time. But depending on the structure, if you go private, then you have even more time to design your product and so forth. If you become too close to the ownership in terms of stockholders, so that you need to deal with quarterly profits, then you lose a lot of long-term planning and really capacity for the leadership decisions. And so you get what computer companies buying themselves back from their shareholders so that they can restructure themselves. And so in China's case, the Communist Party, which it's a big club of self-selected people based on certain criteria of education and thinking, then they select a board of directors, and you could say the board of directors, and then it has its committees that end up with the Politburo and the Standing Committee of the Politburo, and that group makes the decision about the government, which is the State Council and the major ministries that report to the State Council, and so there are many steps between, you could say, the grassroots constituencies and the decision makers, and they therefore have more freedom to make long-term decisions. But the real question is, where are the checks? Where are the bounds? How do you avoid abuses of this kind of isolated power? And there, often it has to do with concern that the party has over social unrest or how they're doing internationally. So you have a whole set of internal criteria for evaluating your corporate leaders. And so it's a structure. It's almost a sort of an Army Corps of Engineers solution to getting your country developed quickly. It's not suitable for feeling your way on the frontier of the technologies of the globe, but it's just an example of institutionalized leadership that has freedom to make long-term decisions, but also react quickly and also to bend the law or break the law because it makes sense. And so how do you attach something like that or evolve a part of yourself as a democratic system to be able to make some of those decisions that are beneficial? And so development banks or infrastructure banks or maybe a supreme economic court or something like that. I don't know, that was my thought.
Ok, thank you. Obrigado.
Eu vou ser breve. Na verdade, eu gostei das duas apresentações, mas não é disso que quero falar. Eu acho que nós estamos falando aqui de desenvolvimento, que é campo de estudos ao qual a América Latina fez consideráveis aportes desde 1949 com os estudos do PPED para aqui, né? Fora essa discussão de se temos uma teoria latino-americana de desenvolvimento ou se você só tem teoria de desenvolvimento com alguns latino-americanos aportando, isso não é importante. O importante é que o estruturalismo pensou América Latina, desde a América Latina, para a América Latina, engajado politicamente, e não foram só economistas, foram sociólogos e economistas, Prebisch, Furtado, Barros de Castro, mas também Gracia Arena, Medina Echevarria. Eu acho que nós hoje temos, e aí eles estabeleceram 3 tópicos, não vou entrar aqui porque seria muito entender, a heterogeneidade estrutural, a deterioração dos termos da troca e a inserção da América Latina. Eu acho que nós temos hoje o grande dilema e isso estou aqui roubando o professor Bresser, que está por aqui, de pensar uma teoria para o desenvolvimento hoje da América Latina, pensar se o estruturalismo ainda é vigente ou não, pensar o desenvolvimento sem prefixos, não neodesenvolvimento, desenvolvimento sem prefixos, aí repensar alguns conceitos. Capacidade estatal em abstrato eu acho difícil, assim, seria Estado desenvolvimentista com capacidades. Aliás, como falou Alexandre, Estado democrático, que é mais difícil ainda que só um Estado desenvolvimentista, porque aí você tem o pluralismo, é mais difícil. O que seria hoje um Estado democrático desenvolvimentista? O que seria hoje capacidade estatal? A ideia das elites e o desenvolvimento, né? Tem projeto liderado por Lewis em Inglaterra, muito interessante sobre isso. Precisamos também método, e aí acho que é importante recuperar a história. Aí temos duplo desafio, analisar processos em andamento para o futuro, mas também analisar a história, legados, trajetórias, né? Recuperar a história como Furtado fazia. Sim. Furtado e outros, Pinto, Zunker, etc. Também, eu acho interessante recuperar a tradição engajada politicamente da CEPAL. Claro, a CEPAL não era um organismo acadêmico, né? Uma instituição multilateral comprometida com governos que fazia relação com acadêmicos. Eu acho que nós devíamos não só ter um engajamento político, mas também aglomerar diferentes iniciativas que estão em andamento. A rede desenvolvimentista aqui do Brasil, o projeto Prebisch que a CEPAL está levando na frente, porque acho que aí temos outro desafio. Queria fazer algumas coisas. Hoje o professor Frenkel falava do otimismo ou pessimismo, só para acabar. Se ser pessimistas ou otimistas, Em termos de pensar conceitos, também centro-periferia. É óbvio que hoje ainda temos centro e temos periferia, mas onde está o centro e onde está a periferia? Desde o ponto de vista de inovação, pode estar em um país, a produção pode estar na China, a inovação nos Estados Unidos ou na Europa. É pensar esses conceitos, que são os mesmos de sempre, mas em outras realidades. A China também modifica a ideia de catching up, né? Essa coisa de crescer muito para cortar distância. É a segunda economia, vai ser a primeira em 3, 4 anos. Então, muitos conceitos. Eu acho que nós temos essa coisa de trabalhar conceitos muito conhecidos, mas que ficavam antigos. Estado desenvolvimentista, por exemplo, o livro de Johnson, que todos citamos, é prévio à ideia de auge do movimento financeiro. O livro de 82, nos anos 80, começa com essa globalização financeira. Então, acho repensar esses conceitos. Para acabar, ser otimistas ou pessimistas, acho um momento ótimo para pensar esse movimento. Para a América Latina, desde a América Latina, pensar com nossas próprias cabeças, para usar a frase do Previc. Por muitas coisas. Já sabemos que não tem uma deterioração de termos da troca, o campo, a CEPAL está mostrando que você tem ciclos de commodities, e estamos em um ciclo mais do que positivo desde 2003 para aqui. Estados Unidos já não pode marcar agenda, já não tem um backyard, pátio traseiro, isso não existe. Nos anos 80, quando os Estados Unidos votava contra um país da América Latina no Banco Mundial, no Fundo Monetário, esse país não obtinha o crédito. Estados Unidos há anos que vem votando, e agora a Inglaterra está nesse clube, votando contra a Argentina do Banco Mundial e não tem efeito. A Argentina continua tendo acesso aos financiamentos dos programas sociais. Eu acho que isso é interessante em termos geopolíticos. O terceiro, que não é menor, os governos de esquerda, como cada um quiser definir isso, esquerda, laboristas, que coincide também com esse novo ciclo positivo, né? Abre a possibilidade, como Renato está trabalhando com alguns artigos, e Fabiano também trabalha com social-democracia, de uma social-democracia no momento que a social-democracia na Europa está em retrocesso. Então, abre essa possibilidade para pensar o que seria uma social-democracia, também um conceito que vem da Europa, mas a América Latina, os processos aqui estariam reconsiderando isso, devemos pensar. Vou parar por aqui porque Celina falou que já acabou o tempo.
Thank you. Just briefly, I wanted to come back on the point of Andreas and Giovanni on the idea of the developmental state, because I think, and perhaps I hope I didn't convey the wrong impression, but the big reason for the resistance was precisely the rise of the developmental state literature. I don't think in all cases, but there's a very clear, in the negotiating room, they use the example of China and the Southeast Asian countries as the work of yourself, Hajun, Robert Wade, and you can actually see it in the minutes of the dialogue with the EU about exactly what the lessons are from the newly industrialized countries. Moreover, if you look at Soludo, who's the former central bank governor of Nigeria, has been instrumental in West Africa, and it's one of his authored with Hajun. So you can actually see, and then through the South Center, and I think this is the point for the school, the South Center brings a lot of the ideas of the researchers from the sort of developmental state directly to the negotiators. And they've done a lot of work behind the scenes with the negotiators to interpret the texts and help them develop alternative texts. So you can see it all the way through, and so I think that within the lobbying is there, but you have the sort of idea of industrial policy and the Singapore issues and what the implications are filtering into the negotiating room and contributing to the kind of pushback.
Just a brief, more conceptual statement, because it was coming up several times, the whole discussion of how to combine the politics and the economics from the morning and the afternoon. But I mean, it strikes me that, maybe I'm saying something that's self-evident, but that's precisely the field of political economy, or old political economy in that sense. And in particular, so what we might call an institutionalist political economy, whether it's from a Marxist tradition, Polanyian tradition, or evolutionary tradition. And what strikes me, I don't wish to sort of reduce what the points that Renato was making in the opening, but it struck me that a lot of what you were saying was essentially you could label as a type of historical institutionalism that is basically, and a lot of the discussion is, I mean, we deal with a lot of that in social policy, for instance, and in terms of how do you bring about these critical junctures, and particularly the sort of the dialectical understanding of how these junctures come about without anyone being necessarily aware of the consequences, like the classical Marxist theories of the origins of capitalism and so on. And in that sense, I find, well, Emily could probably speak to this better than me, but of course the work of Mushtaq Khan in this respect, in terms of, is fantastic in that sense, in terms of understanding what sort of sets off this process of productivity increases and so on in the interaction between the political and the economic. And it strikes me that the whole discussion in the morning it's sort of like the macroeconomic discussion was more of a discussion of the sort of the structure of the constraints and the opportunities, rather than actually explaining what's driving the process of growth, essentially, right? Which is fundamentally a political economy process. And it strikes me as well always that that actually, whether it's neoclassical or Keynesian economics, they're not very good at actually, they describe what growth might be, as in the accumulation of capital or constrained by demand and so on, but they don't actually explain growth. They don't actually explain growth, how growth happens. And that's really the field of sort of institutionalist political economy is perhaps the strongest sort of way of actually analyzing that process. And I mean, if the example, for instance, in China, I mean, going back to what Albert was referring to, I mean, there was a whole literature in the 80s and 90s referring to local state corporatism, for instance, whereas I think that term corporatism comes up, and it's actually and it's comparable to, I think, a lot of the analysis that Mushtaq Khan was making, although I'm not sure if they were informed by each other or not. But it's actually in the gradual process of very fuzzy, undefined property rights gradually eroding from full state-owned property rights to not private property rights, but something in between. And the ability of various actors, often elite actors, to become very wealthy in the process of taking advantage of these property rights, so long as they produce the productive outcomes, and as they set up an incentive type of system, whether or not this was actually intentional or not, it was the result of the process, at least in the 80s, whereby. And it wasn't even the situation of industrial policy in Korea and Taiwan, for instance, where if the chaebols in Korea, for instance, don't produce the productive outcomes, they get their monopoly taken away. It was that your ability to profit individually from the fuzzy property rights was conditional on your ability to be very productive with those property rights, with the use of those property rights. And I've read recently some similar analysis in the 2000s, a Chinese political economist making a similar analysis with the tax reforms that happened in the 90s and then continuing tax reforms in the 2000s, making a very similar argument that, for instance, the central government and the local governments did not necessarily intend this type of outcome to have occurred, but in the process of reforming the tax system, put a whole lot of pressures on local governments who were basically, a lot of their tax allocation had been centralized to the central government, taken away from the local. And yet a lot of fiscal responsibilities were still being placed on them for health, education, and so on. And hence there was a lot of strain, and also urbanization, which is very rapid in China currently. A lot of strain in this type of system, which was then driving them into this whole process of basically appropriating peri-urban land and developing productive outcomes and so on, which this author, I mean, I think what doesn't explain the entire picture, but is this type of institutionalist analysis that helps us both understand a lot of the political coalitions as well as the growth process much better than, say, the discussion of this morning, which was mostly about the structural constraints that would either constrain or facilitate that messy process underlying that. But I wanted to throw that out there because it seems that that integration exists. Mainstream economics, of course, doesn't deal with all of that, but I think there is that field of institutionalist political economy where that this forum would be an ideal forum to advance, basically. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Just a couple of very short comments, because the discussion has been so rich. I feel tempted to speak quite a lot about the various issues, but let me just focus on two very practical things and then mention two aspects which I will try to elaborate upon tomorrow afternoon. First of all, with regards to state capacity, you pointed out very clearly, Inez, that students have to find their own problems and solve their own problems. And I think one of the things we have to realize is that the situations that we are facing now, the possibilities and capabilities for action are very different from the ones that we sort of read about or studied. I think that we have to start thinking about the concept of distributed capacity of the state. in the sense we don't need perhaps a bureaucracy with 150 people, Robert, or we don't need a lot of people. What we need is a small group of highly competent people who can define what needs to be done, who can define terms of reference, and then subcontract, work with others, engage the private, other public agencies, civil society organizations, academia, and then after that evaluate and learn. But that is a very different type of capacity in the state than the ones we are usually accustomed to have, a fairly large department or bureaucracy. This requires, among other things, much more faster and sort of lower barriers to entry and exit from the public sector, being able to use creatively the revolving doors between public, private, civil society, academic, and institutions, which we don't know how to use very well. And we, on the contrary, tend to put barriers when what we need is the circulation in a much better. The second point has to do with something that you mentioned, Ana Celia, about strategy. And I think we have to think strategy not only as we normally do, but strategy even at a much more complex and meta level. 40 years ago, Amilcar Herrera and I worked together on these ideas of explicit and implicit policies. That what we were doing with the policies for science and technology, we were undoing with finance policy, we were undoing with labor policies and so on. And in the end, we ended up with a mess. So what is required now is, given the more interconnected, more complex, more sort of second-order consequences, interactions, to think of strategy at a much more complex and messier level than we did before. Once again, you need a small group of people, of political economists, not economists and political scientists. You need the two of them within your own head, and plus a few other things in order to be able to work in that practical manner. But we need to look at strategy in that much more complex, much more messier, much more evolving setting that we have done up to now. Third, someone mentioned the issue of checks and balances. And however tempting the solution of having a wonderful sort of efficient state, those of us who have been in Latin America for many years and working at both at the policy, political, academic level are sort of tired of hearing about the efficiency of authoritarian regimes. And this is something that I had to do it politically with Fujimori, I had to do it before and so on. But, we really must once and for all realize that in this very messy, dynamic, complex world that we are in, authoritarian and vertical regimes, however efficient they may have seemed in the Korean past or however efficient they may seem in the China of today, are really sort of deadly in a cultural tradition when caudillismo is the rule. So I would strongly advise, whatever research program we do, that we insert right from the beginning the idea of checks and balances. And a final point, if you allow me, please, Selina, is simply on this question on strategies, on development strategies, or whether we need a developmental state. And I fully agree with you, we have to go back, and we all have done that in our books and reports and so on, to the early history of Latin America, structuralism, and so on and so forth. But the ground is shifting. I do believe that we are in a situation which is much, much, much more messier and complex, as I was saying earlier, but even there, that we are shifting to a different type of way of thinking what progress, development are at present. And here we are talking about all the things that we need looking is, as I used to say to my students, we are walking backwards into the future. That is fine, provided that you have a level field. But the field we're facing now, it's all with ups and downs, and walking backwards is the surest way of really sort of doing a mess. I will talk about this tomorrow, so let me stop here for the time being.
Eu tentei aqui fazer um pouco um resumo do que a gente poderia imaginar como uma agenda para pensar conceitualmente a ideia de capacidade estatal. E comecei a imaginar, esse conceito nos levaria a uma dimensão teleológica, ou seja, a capacidade estatal está relacionada a um propósito normativo, ela teria que estar ancorada em alguns propósitos ou não. Basicamente, a capacidade de implementar políticas já justificaria conceitualmente essa dimensão. Se a gente abandonar essa dimensão teleológica, a gente imaginaria apenas como uma técnica, né? Ampliar a capacidade de as políticas serem anotadas num certo tempo e com um certo nível de produtividade, né? E de eficácia, digamos assim. Mas isso não levaria, do ponto de vista normativo, necessariamente a um bom resultado, digamos, né? Por exemplo, o Brasil, mesmo no período de liberalização, conseguiu manter a capacidade de arrecadação tributária de forma bastante eficaz. Mas o produto dessa arrecadação não foi direcionada para a expansão do mercado interno, nem teve qualquer resultado distributivo, vamos dizer assim. Então, essa capacidade, enfim, foi direcionada para um outro propósito que, em si, não trouxe resultados. Mais recentemente, a gente pode imaginar uma reapropriação desse fundo. Então, eu comecei a imaginar aqui quais seriam os cenários, digamos assim, normativos para imaginar o produto de uma capacidade estatal. Primeiro, a ideia de crescimento. Quer dizer, a ideia de crescimento como expansão da renda, né? E depois, além do crescimento, imaginar, por exemplo, crescimento com inclusão. A ideia de crescimento incorporando parcelas que estavam destituídas de renda nesse processo. Ou seja, nós temos crescimento para pensar num conjunto de países que mais crescem, por exemplo, os BRICS. Nós temos países que crescem muito e redistribuem pouco. Pelo contrário, o crescimento vem sendo acompanhado com concentração de renda. China, Rússia, Índia, o Brasil sofreu alguma melhora nos últimos 10 anos, mas o fosso social ainda é razoavelmente grande. Um outro tópico, crescimento com democracia, né? O crescimento tem sido acompanhado por uma expansão do empoderamento político por parte da sociedade. Em que cenário? Na China, bastante controverso, né? Rússia, bom, a gente não precisa entrar em muitos detalhes. O Brasil, alguma dimensão desde a Constituição de 88, você tem uma expansão dos pontos de veto no âmbito das esferas de poder, né, e a expansão também de algumas autarquias e órgãos de controle, que expandiu bastante o poder de veto de setores organizados na sociedade, né. E o último tópico, crescimento com inclusão, diversificação produtiva, tecnológica ou com regressão tecnológica. O que temos visto é, em grande medida, uma expansão do crescimento. Por exemplo, a Rússia e a Índia têm taxas de crescimento razoavelmente elevadas, mas não há muita clareza se isso tem sido produto. O Brasil também tem taxas mais baixas do que esse país, mas isso não tem se verificado nem sido acompanhado de uma expansão da sua matriz tecnológica, ou seja, a base produtiva nem sempre é acompanhada dessa dimensão. Então, eu acho que esses tópicos mereceriam, talvez, um tipo de arranjo para a gente imaginar normativamente o conceito de capacidade estatal, porque ele é um instrumento de análise que não necessariamente resulta num produto que possa, digamos assim, ser aproveitável no longo prazo, né? Porque imaginando um cenário analítico para a gente imaginar linhas de pesquisa para uma escola que pensa a questão do desenvolvimento.
Obrigada. Ainda, acho que, I don't know if, well, how tired you are, but formally we still have half an hour, but I think everybody's very tired. So, all right, Mrs. President. So thank you very much and see you all tomorrow.
Really very glad. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you.